My name is Kanadi Blackhorse, and I've been a park ranger at Cherokee National Forest for 8 years. The irony of the name isn't lost on me, a Cherokee descendant protecting land that was once freely roamed by my ancestors before the Trail of Tears. My grandmother always said our family carried the old blood, the blood of guardians, and that the forest would call to me eventually. She was right, though not in the way either of us expected. The radio crackled to life at 6:47 a.m., cutting through the morning mist that clung to the tree line like spirits unwilling to pass on. Ranger Blackhorse, we've got a missing persons report. A family of 4 didn't return from their camping trip yesterday. Last known location was the Tellico Creek Trail. I pressed the radio button, already pulling on my boots. Copy that, dispatch. Heated at trailhead is 30 minutes. The morning air carried something different today, a heaviness that settled in my chest like a weight. My grandmother used to say that our people could sense when the forest was disturbed, when something walked among the trees that shouldn't be there. I'd always dismissed it as old superstition, until I started working these mountains. Cherokee National Forest spans over 650,000 acres across Tennessee and North Carolina, most of it dense wilderness where cell service dies and human voices become whispers in an ocean of green. I've pulled lost hikers from ravines, tracked down missing children, and cleaned up after bears that got too comfortable around campsites. But in 8 years, I'd never lost anyone. Not permanently. The Hendricks family, Mike, Sarah, and their twin boys, 8 years old, had registered for a 3-day camping permit at Tellico Creek. Experienced hikers, according to their paperwork. They'd camped the trail before. Mike Hendricks was a military veteran. Sarah was a nurse. Not the type to panic or make stupid decisions in the wilderness. I drove the winding mountain road toward the trailhead, my ranger vehicle humming through switchbacks that carved through ancient Appalachian peaks. The radio chattered with routine morning updates from other rangers across the district, but my mind kept drifting to my grandmother's stories. She used to tell me about Keekly Cudley, the hairy man of Cherokee legend, a giant that walked upright like a man but was wild as the storm. Most tribes had similar stories. The Lakota called it Cheatonka, the Ojibwe knew it as Babaganoush, different names for the same shadow that moved between trees. The trailhead parking area was empty, except for a blue Toyota Highlander with Tennessee plates. I ran the license, confirmed it belonged to Mike Hendricks. Their vehicle had been there since Friday morning, meaning they'd been missing for over 36 hours. In these mountains, that could mean hypothermia, injury, dehydration, or worse. I shouldered my pack and checked my gear. GPS unit, emergency medical supplies, water purification tablets, emergency shelter, and my grandfather's hunting knife, the one my grandmother insisted I carry. Iron cuts what shouldn't be walking, she used to say. Uppity? The knife had been forged by my great-great-grandfather, its blade etched with symbols I'd never learned to read. The Tellico Creek Trail started easy, a well-maintained path that wound alongside the rushing water. I'd hiked it dozens of times during my tenure, knew every route and rock that could catch an unwary boot. The family had signed in at the trail register Friday morning at 8:15 a.m. Mike's handwriting was neat, precise. Hendricks family, party of 4, returning Sunday p.m. As I hiked deeper into the forest, something felt off. The woods were too quiet. No bird songs, no squirrel chatter, no insects buzzing. Even the creek seemed muted, its normal babbling reduced to an anxious whisper. In Cherokee tradition, when the forest goes silent, it means something powerful is near, something that commands respect or fear from the smaller creatures. 3 miles in, I found their first campsite. The fire ring showed recent use, and I could see where their tent had been pitched on a flat section near the water. Everything looked normal, too normal. No scattered gear. No signs of struggle, no indication they'd left in a hurry. It was as if they'd simply vanished. I knelt beside the cold fire pit and stirred the ashes with a stick. Underneath the gray dust, I found something that made my blood run cold, a child's toy, a small plastic dinosaur, melted and twisted from intense heat. No campfire burns hot enough to melt plastic like that. My radio crackled. Ranger Blackhorse, what's your status? Found their first campsite. No signs of distress, but something's not right here. Continuing up trail. Copy that. Be advised, we've got storm clouds moving in from the west. You've got maybe 4 hours before heavy rain. Clicked off the radio and stood scanning the tree line. The silence pressed against my eardrums like deep water. As I shouldered my pack, I noticed something else a smell carried on the wind. Musky, wild, like wet fur, and something else I couldn't identify. Something organic and primal that made the hair on my arms stand up. 4 miles up the trail, I found their second campsite. This one told a different story. The tent was still standing, but the rainfly was shredded, hanging in strips like giant claws had raked across it. Sleeping bags were scattered around the site, and I could see what looked like massive footprints in the soft earth near the creek. I pulled out my measuring tape and photographed the prints, 18 inches long, 7 inches wide, with distinct toe impressions. The stride length was over 4 feet. No bear made tracks like these. No human either. My grandmother's voice echoed in my memory. The old ones who walk between worlds. They leave signs for those who know how to read them. The largest print was directly outside where the tent door would have been, as if something had stood there looking in. I followed the trail of disturbed vegetation and broken branches leading away from the campsite. Whatever had been here was big enough to snap 3-inch saplings without slowing down. The trail led uphill, toward the wilderness area where the maintained trails ended and the true forest began. My radio buzzed with static as I climbed higher. Cell towers couldn't reach into these hollows, and even the ranger radio network grew spotty in the deep mountains. I was alone now, following a trail that defied every rational explanation I'd been trained to consider. The track led to a game trail that wound through a grove of ancient hemlocks, their massive trunks scarred by decades of storms and ice. Here the canopy was so thick that afternoon seemed like dusk, and here I found the first piece of human clothing Sarah Hendricks' blue hiking jacket, torn and muddy, hanging from a branch 8 feet off the ground. Below it, pressed into the soft forest floor, was the clearest footprint I'd ever seen. The toes were articulated, almost human but wrong somehow, too long, too powerful. And beside it, barely visible in the damp earth, was a child's boot print. They were alive when they were taken. That print was fresh. I keyed my radio, hoping for any signal. Static answered me. I was on my own, following something into the wilderness that shouldn't exist, carrying nothing but my training, my grandfather's knife, and the growing certainty that everything my grandmother had told me about the old things in these mountains was true. The trail continued deeper into darkness, and I followed. The game trail wound through terrain that grew increasingly hostile. Thick stands of mountain laurel formed natural walls on either side, their gnarled branches creating a tunnel effect that blocked most of the remaining daylight. My headlamp cut a weak cone through the gloom, illuminating only fragments of the path ahead. Every 100 yards or so, I found another piece of evidence. Mike's baseball cap caught on a thorn bush. One of the boy's small hiking boots, laces still tied, sitting in the middle of the trail as if it had been carefully placed there. Each item was positioned where I couldn't miss it, like breadcrumbs leading me deeper into the forest. But breadcrumbs in fairy tales led children to danger, not safety. My GPS unit showed I was now 6 miles from the nearest maintained trail, climbing toward an unnamed ridge that appeared on topographic maps as a blank expanse of green. The elevation was approaching 4,000 feet, and the temperature had dropped 15 degrees since I'd left the trailhead. If the Hendricks family was still alive, exposure would become a critical factor within hours. A sound stopped me cold, a low, resonant call that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. It wasn't quite a howl, wasn't quite a roar. It was something between the two, but with an intelligence behind it that raised every primitive alarm in my nervous system. The sound echoed off the ridges for nearly 30 seconds before fading into silence. In Cherokee legend, Kekle Kudle could mimic human voices to lure people deeper into the wilderness. But this wasn't mimicry. This was a voice entirely its own, announcing its presence to anything listening. I checked my watch. 4:30 p.m. The storm clouds I'd seen gathering over the western peaks were darker now, and I could feel the barometric pressure dropping. Mountain weather could turn lethal in minutes, and I was already beyond the point where I could safely retreat before nightfall. So, the trail began to descend into a narrow valley I didn't recognize from any park map. Ancient rhododendrons formed dense thickets on the slopes, their glossy leaves creating an almost tropical understory. The creek I'd been following had grown into a small river, fed by dozens of unnamed streams cascading down from hidden hollows. Here, in this forgotten valley, I found evidence of long-term habitation. Not human habitation, something else. Saplings had been bent and woven together to form crude shelters among the rhododendrons. The structures were too large for humans but showed a clear intelligence in their construction. They were positioned to provide shelter from prevailing winds while maintaining sight lines up and down the valley. Near one of these structures, I found a cache of bones. Most were deer, bear, and wild boar normal forest prey, but mixed among them were objects that didn't belong. A child's backpack, faded and weathered, with a school district logo I didn't recognize. A woman's hiking boot, size 8, with moss growing through the eyelets, and pinned to a nearby tree with what looked like a 6-inch thorn. A missing person poster that was at least 5 years old. The face on the poster was that of Jessica Martinez, age 26, last seen hiking the Appalachian Trail in North Carolina. I remembered the case she'd vanished without a trace despite extensive search efforts involving multiple agencies and volunteer groups. The poster showed signs of deliberate preservation, as if someone or something wanted it to remain legible. My radio sputtered to life with broken transmissions. Ranger Black. Respond. Storm warning, immediate evacuation. I tried to respond but got only static. The mountains were cutting me off from the outside world just as the first heavy raindrops began to fall through the canopy. That's when I heard the voices. They were coming from deeper in the valley, human voices calling for help. A woman's voice strained with exhaustion. Please, someone help us. And a man's voice, stronger but edged with desperation. We're here, Sarah and Mike Hendricks. They were alive. I switched off my headlamp and moved carefully toward the voices, using the sound of the rain and rushing water to mask my approach. My grandfather's knife felt heavy on my belt, and I loosened it in its sheath. Something about this felt wrong. The voices were too clear, too perfectly positioned to draw me forward. The valley opened into a natural amphitheater surrounded by steep stone walls. At the center sat the Hendricks family around a small fire, apparently unharmed. Mike was tending the flames while Sarah held both boys close to her body. They looked exhausted but alive. Relief flooded through me until I noticed the details that didn't fit. Their clothes were dirty but not torn. They had a fire going despite the rain, and they were sitting in a perfect circle with their backs to the surrounding forest as if they'd been positioned there. I was about to call out when movement in the trees behind them caught my eye. Something massive shifted in the shadows between the rhododendrons, staying just out of reach of the firelight. It was watching them, watching me, with an intelligence that felt ancient and utterly alien. The thing in the shadows was easily 8 feet tall, covered in dark, matted hair that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its eyes were the worst part, not animal eyes, but something that held far too much awareness. When it looked directly at me, I felt the weight of a predator's attention unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Sarah Hendricks looked up suddenly, as if she'd heard something. Mike, she whispered, it's back. Stay calm, Mike said quietly. Don't look at it directly. It doesn't like that. The boys whimpered and pressed closer to their mother. They'd been here for over a day, I realized. Whatever had taken them was keeping them alive, maintaining them like livestock. The creature in the shadows took a step forward, and I caught a glimpse of its full form. Lorna caught a glimpse of its full form. It moved with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for something so massive. Its arms hung nearly to its knees, ending in hands that were disturbingly human-like but scaled up to horrific proportions. As it approached the fire, the family huddled closer together, but didn't run. They'd learned not to run. I had to act now or lose my chance. I pulled my grandfather's knife from its sheath, the blade catching what little firelight filtered through the rain. The metal seemed to hum with some resonance I could feel in my bones. The creature stopped, its massive head turning toward me with mechanical precision. When our eyes met across the firelight, I understood why my grandmother had insisted I carry iron. This thing wasn't entirely of the natural world. It was something older, something that existed in the spaces between what humans understood as reality. It spoke then, not with vocal cords, but directly into my mind, using words in a language I'd never heard but somehow understood. Guardian of the small fires, you carry the old metal. Intel. You know the old ways. The voice in my head was like standing next to a waterfall, overwhelming and ancient. Let them go, I said aloud, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. They came seeking the deep places. Now they belong to the deep places. Now they belong to the deep places. As will you, little guardian, unless you prove worthy of the old compact. And thunder crashed overhead, and in the lightning flash that followed, I saw dozens of eyes watching from the surrounding forest. We weren't alone. We'd never been alone. We'd never been alone. The lightning illuminated a truth more terrifying than I'd imagined. The eyes surrounding us belonged to creatures of various sizes, some as massive as the one by the fire, others smaller but no less menacing. They'd arranged themselves in a perfect circle around the natural amphitheater, watching with the patience of predators who had all the time in the world. The old compact, I said, keeping my voice steady despite the fear coursing through my veins. I don't know what you're talking about. The massive creature tilted its head, studying me with those two intelligent eyes. Your blood remembers even if your mind is forgotten. The first people made agreements with those who walked before. We would keep to the deep places, and your kind would keep to the edges. But your kind has forgotten how to listen. Sarah Hendricks looked up at me, her face streaked with tears and mud. Ranger, she whispered, it's been talking to us. It says we violated something by coming too deep into its territory. Mike kept his arms around his boys, his military training evident in how he positioned himself between them and the creature. It wants us to choose, he said quietly. One of us stays and the rest go free. The creature's laugh was like wind through a graveyard. The soldier understands the old mathematics. Always there must be balance. Your kind takes from the deep places wood, stone, water, peace. Something must be given in return. I stepped closer to the fire, my grandfather's knife still in my hand. The blade seemed to pulse with its own light, and I noticed the creature kept its distance from the iron. My grandmother told me stories, I said, about the hairy men of the mountains, about treaties and boundaries and respect. But those were just stories. Stories, the creature repeated, and its voice carried amusement and sorrow in equal measure. Your grandmother was Ayana Blackhorse. She was the last of your line to honor the old ways. When she died, we thought the compact was broken forever. The mention of my grandmother's name hit me like a physical blow. Ayana had been her Cherokee name, the one she'd never told anyone outside the family. You knew her. She brought offerings to the boundary stones, sweet tobacco and cornmeal. She sang the old songs when the moon was dark. She remembered that the forest was not empty before your cities came. Images flashed through my memory, my grandmother disappearing into the woods on certain nights, returning at dawn with dirt under her fingernails and leaves in her hair. She'd always said she was tending the old places, but I'd assumed she meant family graves or sacred sites. I'd never imagined she was maintaining some ancient treaty with creatures that shouldn't exist. The storm was intensifying, turning the narrow valley into a cauldron of wind and rain. Lightning struck somewhere nearby, and in the brief illumination, I counted at least 20 pairs of eyes watching from the forest. The Hendricks family was trapped in the center of a council that had been deliberating their fate for over a day. What do you want from them? I asked. They're just people who got lost. Lost. The creature seemed to taste the word. No one finds this place by accident. The deep valleys call to those who carry old blood or old pain. This family was guided here by something they don't understand. I looked more closely at Mike Hendricks, noting details I'd missed before. The way he held himself, the protective positioning, the calm acceptance of an impossible situation. You're Native American, I said. Mike nodded slowly. Lakota on my mother's side. My boys are quarter blood. Sarah's been having dreams about this place for months. We thought we were just planning a camping trip. Sarah's voice was barely audible over the storm. The dreams showed me the valley, the stone walls even. She gestured toward the creature without looking at it directly. Even him. I thought they were just stress dreams from work. People die in my ear, every week, children, family. I thought my mind was just processing trauma. The creature moved closer to the fire, and I could see its features more clearly. The face was almost human but elongated, with a ridge of bone above eyes that held depths I couldn't fathom. When it spoke, I could see rows of teeth designed for more than just vegetation. The nurse dreams of death because death seeks her. The soldier knows war because war shaped him. The children carry the blood of those who understood the deep places. And you, guardian, you carry iron blessed by the old words and steel tempered in promises your people made to mine. I looked down at my grandfather's knife, seeing for the first time the true age of the symbols etched into the blade. They weren't Cherokee, they were older, something from before the tribes had names for themselves. Your grandmother brought this blade to the boundary stones every season, the creature continued. She renewed the compact with her blood and her words. When she died, we waited. We hoped another would come who remembered the old responsibilities. And if I don't, if I can't, the creature gestured to the eyes surrounding us. Then the compact dies with you, and we take back all that was promised to the deep places, starting with this valley, then the next. Then all of them, until the forest run red with those who forgot how to listen. The thunder was constant now, and I could hear trees falling somewhere in the darkness. We were running out of time. If I didn't act soon, the storm would trap us here permanently. We see. Tell me what the compact requires, I said. The creature smiled, and the expression was more terrifying than its anger had been. Blood freely given to seal the promise. A guardian who will remember the boundaries and teach others to respect them. And a choice prove you understand the old mathematics, or watch as all debts are collected in full. It gestured toward the Hendricks family. 4 took from the deep places. 1 must remain to balance the scales. Choose, guardian. Choose wisely. Mike stood up slowly, his hands raised. Take me. My family goes free and I stay. No, Sarah said firmly. I'm the one who led us here. This is my responsibility. Both boys started crying, clinging to their parents with the desperate strength of children who understand that something terrible is about to happen. I looked at my grandfather's knife, at the symbols that seemed to writhe in the firelight, and made a decision that would either save us all or damn us. There's another way, I said, pressing the blade against my palm until blood welled up. The compact was between guardians and those who walk the deep places. I'm a guardian. I renew the treaty in my blood and my promise. The creature watched as I let my blood drip onto the earth between us. And what do you promise, last son of the old blood? I promise to remember, to teach others to remember, to maintain the boundaries and respect the deep places. And I promise that those who honor the compact will be protected, while those who violate it will face the consequences. Lightning struck directly overhead, and in that blinding moment, I felt something ancient and vast accept my words. The knife in my hand grew warm, and the symbols on the blade flared with a light that had nothing to do with fire. When my vision cleared, the eyes in the forest were gone. The creature remained, but its posture had changed. It no longer looked like a predator evaluating prey. The compact is renewed, it said, and its voice now carried respect instead of threat. Guard your people well, Kanati Blackhorse. Teach them the old boundaries, and remember we are always watching. It melted back into the shadows between the trees, leaving us alone with the storm and the dying fire. Is it over? Sarah whispered. I looked at the knife in my hand, at the blood on its blade, and at the family who would live to tell a story no one would believe. No, I said quietly. It's just beginning. The silence that followed the creature's departure was more unsettling than its presence had been. The storm continued to rage overhead, but the oppressive weight of being watched had lifted. The Hendricks family sat huddled together, staring at me with expressions of shock, gratitude, and fear. We need to move, I said, checking my watch, 8:30 p.m. We had maybe 4 hours before hypothermia became a critical threat. This valley will flood if the rain keeps up, and I don't know how stable that compact really is. Mike stood first, helping Sarah to her feet. The boys, I realized I still didn't know their names, clung to their parents but moved when directed. They'd learned to trust adult judgment during their ordeal, even when that judgment defied everything they'd been taught about the world. Which way? Mike asked, scanning the dark walls of the amphitheater. I consulted my GPS, grateful it was still functioning. There's a drainage that leads north toward Copper Ridge. It's rough terrain, but it connects to a fire road about 3 miles from here. What I didn't tell them was that the route would take us through some of the most dangerous terrain in the forest's steep slopes, unstable rock faces and creek crossings that could become death traps in a flash flood. But staying in the valley wasn't an option. The creatures might honor the compact, but nature followed its own rules, As we gathered what remained of their gear, Sarah pulled me aside. "Ranger," she said quietly, "what really happened back there? What did you promise them?" I looked at my grandfather's knife, now cleaned and sheathed, but somehow different than it had been that morning. I promised to be what my grandmother was, a bridge between worlds, someone who remembers that we're not alone in these mountains. And that's enough. That's all they wanted. "Respect," I said. "Recognition, an acknowledgement that they were here first and have rights we've been ignoring for generations." Most people who disappear in these mountains probably stumbled into their territory by accident and never understood what they'd violated. Phew. Mike rejoined us, carrying one of his sons on his shoulders. "How do we live with this? How do we go back to normal life knowing what we know?" That was the question I'd been dreading. The compact wasn't just between me and the creatures, it bound everyone who knew about it. We were all guardians now, whether we wanted to be or not. "We tell the story," I said, "not to authorities, not to media, but to the right people, other rangers, experienced guides, people who spend time in the deep wilderness. We make sure the boundaries are respected." Dawn. The climb out of the valley was brutal. The drainage channel I'd identified was little more than a slash between rock faces filled with loose stone and deadfall. Every few minutes, lightning would illuminate our precarious route, revealing just how close we were to slopes that could avalanche with a single misstep. The boys Tommy and Jake, I learned, were remarkable. Despite being 8 years old and exhausted from their ordeal, they followed instructions without complaint and helped each other over difficult sections. Their parents had raised them well. An hour into the climb, we reached a narrow ledge where we could rest and reassess. The rain was beginning to let up, but I could hear the roar of water rushing through channels below us. The valley was flooding just as I'd predicted. "Look," Sarah said, pointing back toward the valley floor. In the lightning flashes, we could see shapes moving through the rising water. Tall figures wading through the flood with impossible grace, gathering objects from the abandoned structures and carrying them to higher ground. The creatures were protecting their territory from the storm, just as any intelligent species would. "They're not monsters," Mike said quietly. "They're just people, different from us, but people." I thought about the bone cache I'd found, about the missing person posters preserved like trophies. They're people with their own laws and their own justice. We violated their territory, and they had the right to demand satisfaction. How? The compact gives us a way to coexist, but it doesn't make them safe. We continued climbing through the night, following game trails and stream beds that led ever higher toward civilization. My radio remained silent. We were still too deep in the mountains for contact with the outside world. EUA's side world. For all anyone knew, we were all missing now. At 2 a.m., we finally reached the fire road. My legs were shaking with exhaustion, and the family was stumbling with every step, but we were alive, and we were together, and we'd learned something about the world that couldn't be unlearned. I used my emergency beacon to signal for pickup, and within an hour, we could hear the sound of ATVs approaching through the forest. Other rangers, search and rescue volunteers, people who'd been looking for us. What do we tell them? Sarah asked as the lights approached. "That you got lost in the storm and I found you," I said. "That's true enough. Everything else is between us." The rescue team was led by Ranger Martinez, a 20-year veteran who'd worked these mountains longer than anyone. Veta. As he helped load the exhausted family onto the ATVs, he pulled me aside. "Strangest thing," he said quietly. "We've been finding items from old missing person cases scattered around the forest edges. Backpacks, clothing, ID cards, stuff that's been missing for years. It's like someone's been collecting them and suddenly decided to return them." I thought about the compact, about promises made and boundaries reestablished. "Maybe the mountains are cleaning house," I said. Martinez studied my face in the ATV headlights. "You look different, Black Horse." Older somehow. What happened out there? I handed him my grandfather's knife, showing him the symbols etched into the blade. My grandmother used to say that some jobs change the person who does them. I think I understand what she meant now. He examined the blade, frowning at the ancient symbols. "This looks old, really old." "It is, and now it's mine to carry, along with everything that comes with it." As we rode back towards civilization, the storm finally broke, and dawn began to creep over the eastern ridges. The Hendricks family slept against each other in the back of the ATV, exhausted but alive. They'd carry the memory of their encounter for the rest of their lives, but they'd also carry the responsibility of the compact. I looked back once toward the deep mountains, toward valleys that held secrets older than human civilization. Something moved in the tree line, a massive shape that lifted one hand in what might have been a salute or a warning. The compact was renewed, but the real work was just beginning. 3 weeks after the incident in the valley, I sat in my grandmother's old cabin, sorting through papers she'd left behind. The Hendricks family had returned to their normal lives in Knoxville, but they called every few days to check in. The dreams had stopped, Sarah told me. The weight of the forest no longer pressed against her consciousness, but mine had just begun. The papers my grandmother had hidden in a wooden box beneath her floorboards told a story spanning generations. Maps of the deep mountains marked with symbols I was beginning to understand. In correspondence with other rangers and guides, all written in careful code about boundary maintenance and territorial agreements, and most disturbing of all, a detailed record of every person who'd gone missing in Cherokee National Forest over the past 50 years. Not all of them had been returned. My radio crackled with the morning briefing. 3 more missing persons reports over the weekend, college students who'd gone off trail despite warnings about storm damage, 2 hikers who'd failed to check in after a day hike on Copper Ridge, and a family from Georgia who'd disappeared from their campsite near the ACO River. The pattern was unmistakable. Word was spreading through some underground network that the deep places were open again, calling to those who carried old blood or old pain. The compact had stabilized one relationship, but it had destabilized others. I strapped on my grandfather's knife and headed for my truck. The real work of a guardian was just beginning. The first missing persons case was easy to resolve. The college students had built an illegal fire during the burn ban and fled when they saw the smoke. I found them hiding in a motel in Tellico Plains, afraid they'd caused a forest fire. A lecture about fire safety and a hefty fine sent them home with a story about ranger authority rather than ancient compacts. The second case was more complicated. The hikers, an elderly couple from Nashville, had indeed gone off trail. I found their bodies at the bottom of a ravine near Copper Ridge, victims of loose shale and poor judgment. Natural deaths in dangerous terrain, nothing supernatural about it. But when I called for the recovery team, I found something else in the ravine that made my blood run cold. Carved into the rock face above where the bodies lay was a symbol I recognized from my grandmother's papers, a spiral surrounded by lines that looked like claws. It was a boundary marker, warning others away from territory that belonged to something else. The couple had crossed into protected space and paid the price. The third case would test everything I thought I understood about the compact. The Georgia family, the Washingtons, had been camping at Acco River when they disappeared. Unlike the Hendricks, these were casual campers with minimal wilderness experience. According to the campground host, they'd asked about Indian ruins and sacred sites, despite being told repeatedly that such areas were protected and off-limits to tourists. I found their abandoned campsite 2 days after they'd been reported missing. Their gear was scattered, their vehicle was unlocked, and there were clear signs of struggle. But the tracks leading away from the site weren't human. The trail led south toward the Sitico Creek wilderness, into terrain so remote that even experienced rangers avoided it, except in emergencies. This was different from the valley where I'd found the Hendricks family. This felt darker, hungrier, more desperate. 5 miles into the wilderness, I found evidence that made me question whether the compact was working at all. Trees had been stripped of bark in perfect spirals, creating patterns that hurt to look at directly. Animal bones hung from branches in configurations that suggested ritualistic purpose. And carved into the ground were symbols that weren't on any of my grandmother's maps, newer markings that spoke of agreements made without guardian oversight. The Washingtons were being held in a grove of ancient oaks that felt wrong from the moment I entered it. The family sat around a smoldering fire, staring into flames that cast no light. They were alive, but their eyes held depths that reminded me of the creature I'd faced in the valley. But the thing guarding them wasn't part of the compact I'd made. It was smaller than the Valley Guardian, more humanoid but somehow more alien. When it spoke, the words came from everywhere and nowhere, bypassing my ears and speaking directly to my nervous system. Guardian, it said. You come to reclaim what has been freely given. One has been freely given. They weren't freely given, I replied, keeping my hand on my grandfather's knife. They were taken without understanding the choice. They sought the sacred places. They wished to possess what cannot be owned. Now they understand the true cost of knowledge. I looked more closely at the Washington family and realized they weren't just changed, they were being consumed. Something was feeding on their life force, their memories, their connection to the human world. If I didn't act soon, there would be nothing left to rescue. The compact was made with the guardians of the deep places, I said. You're not part of that agreement. The creature laughed, and the sound made the oak leaves wither and fall. Compacts can be broken, Guardian. 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 New alliances can be forged. Your grandmother's death left voids that hungry things have filled. This was what I'd feared, that renewing one compact would create opportunities for others to emerge from whatever darkness had birthed them. The balance my grandmother had maintained for decades was fracturing, and I was only one person trying to hold together agreements that spanned generations. I drew my grandfather's knife, and the blade sang with harmonic frequencies that made the creature step back. But instead of advancing, I pressed the edge against my palm, letting my blood drip onto the desecrated ground. I challenged the claim, I said, using words my grandmother's papers had taught me. Blood for blood, guardian for guardian. Release them and face me in the old way. The creature's form shifted, becoming more solid and more terrible. You would risk the compact for strangers who violated sacred boundaries? I would honor the compact by protecting those who don't understand it yet, I replied. That's what guardians do. What followed was less a fight than a test of will. The creature attacked not with claws or teeth, but with visions showing me every person my grandmother had failed to save, every compromise she'd made to keep the peace, every time she'd chosen the greater good over individual lives. It wanted me to understand that being a guardian meant making impossible choices, but it also showed me something else: the deep loneliness of beings that existed between worlds, neither fully wild nor fully civilized. The creature wasn't evil. It was hungry for connection, for acknowledgement, for a place in the order I was trying to maintain. Join the compact, I said, driving my knife into the earth between us. Accept boundaries and protections in exchange for recognition and respect. Be part of the balance instead of fighting against it. The creature considered this for long minutes while the Washington family flickered between human and something else entirely. Finally, it nodded. A new compact, it agreed. New terms for new time. But the guardian must prove worthy of expanded responsibilities. The test was simple and terrible. I had to choose between saving the Washington family immediately or spending time to negotiate proper boundaries that would prevent future incidents. I chose the future, watching as the creature slowly, carefully extracted whatever it had been draining from the family and returned them to full humanity. The Washingtons remembered nothing of their captivity except dreams of being in nature for longer than they'd planned. They accepted my explanation about getting lost and disoriented after eating wild berries that caused mild hallucinations. Another missing persons case closed with a rational explanation that protected the larger truth. But the real victory was the expanded compact, a more complex agreement that included not just the original Valley Guardians, but other entities that had been operating without oversight. It would require more work, more vigilance, more personal sacrifice, but it also offered the possibility of genuine coexistence between worlds that had been at war for generations. As I drove home through the autumn mountains, I realized that my grandmother's legacy wasn't just the knife I carried, or the knowledge she'd preserved. Then, it was the understanding that being a guardian meant growing, adapting, and finding new ways to honor old responsibilities. My radio crackled with another missing persons report: a solo hiker who'd failed to return from the Appalachian Trail. I smiled grimly and turned toward the mountains. The work never ended, but that was exactly as it should be. Some jobs change the person who does them, and some changes are worth making. I was Kanani Blackhorse, guardian of the boundaries, keeper of the compact, and bridge between worlds that needed each other more than they knew. And somewhere in the deep places, ancient eyes watched with approval as I drove toward my next case. The forest was vast, and there was always someone who needed finding. I remember the first time I felt the presence of something watching me in the Cherokee National Forest. The sensation was unmistakable, a prickling along my spine, a sudden stillness in the air as if the entire forest held its breath. My name is Enolia Dare, which means black fox in Cherokee. I come from an ancient lineage of Cherokee people who have lived in these Appalachian mountains since time immemorial. My ancestors were forcibly removed during the Trail of Tears, but my family somehow returned to these sacred lands generation after generation, drawn back by an unbreakable connection to the forest. Today, I serve as a senior park ranger, responsible for protecting these 655,000 acres of wilderness that stretch across eastern Tennessee. The Cherokee National Forest is the largest tract of public land in the state, divided into northern and southern sections by the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. These dense woods contain stories older than human memory, stories my grandmother passed down to me in hushed tones by firelight. The forest has guardians, she would say, her weathered face serious in the dancing shadows. Tsul'kalu', the slant-eyed giant, watches over these mountains. Respect him, and he will respect you. I dismissed these tales as childhood fables until my 3rd year as a ranger. That autumn day began like any other, crisp mountain air filling my lungs as I patrolled the remote eastern section of the forest. This particular area was seldom visited by tourists, with its steep ravines and tangled undergrowth making it nearly impenetrable to casual hikers. I was investigating reports of illegal hunting when the radio at my hip crackled to life. "Ranger Adair, come in." The voice of dispatcher Sarah Hayes broke through the static. "Adair here," I responded, pausing beside a massive oak tree. "We've got a missing persons report. 2 hikers separated from their group near Bald River Falls yesterday afternoon. Search team assembling at headquarters. Can you join?" On my way, I confirmed, already calculating the fastest route back to my vehicle. Bald River Falls was approximately 15 miles from my position, a popular spot for hikers despite its relative remoteness. The 90-foot waterfall crashed over ancient rock formations, creating a misty spectacle that drew photographers and nature enthusiasts alike. Yeah, but the surrounding terrain was treacherous, steep cliffs, dense vegetation, and winding animal trails that could easily disorient inexperienced hikers. As I navigated the narrow Forest Service road back toward headquarters, my mind cataloged the potential dangers. Exposure would be the primary concern if the missing hikers had spent the night outdoors without proper equipment. Mountain temperatures dropped considerably after sunset, even in early autumn. Then there were the physical hazards: falls, injuries, dehydration. What I didn't consider, what I couldn't have anticipated, was that these disappearances would lead me to confront something my ancestors had warned about for centuries. The search and rescue team had already assembled when I arrived at headquarters. 12 rangers and volunteers equipped with topographical maps, first aid supplies, and communication gear. Team lead Marcus Chen briefed us quickly. Missing hikers are James and Melissa Townsend, married couple from Nashville, both 32. They were part of a 6-person group that split up yesterday around 3 p.m. The others returned to the trailhead by 6 p.m. as planned, but the Townsends never showed. Group reported them missing this morning after attempting to reach them by cell phone overnight. "Any medical conditions?" asked Angela Martinez, our medical specialist. "None reported," Marcus replied. Both described as experienced hikers in good physical condition. They had day packs with water and basic supplies, but weren't equipped for overnight. We divided into 4 3-person teams, each assigned to a different search grid. I was partnered with Dave Thornton, a veteran ranger nearing retirement, and Key Jackson, a volunteer with search and rescue experience. Our sector included the southeastern quadrant from Bald River Falls, some of the most rugged terrain in the area. "Stick together," Marcus instructed before we deployed. "Radio check-ins every 30 minutes. If weather turns, we regroup." The sky was clear as we set out, but experience had taught me how quickly mountain weather could change. Clouds could roll in within minutes, transforming a pleasant hike into a disorienting trek through fog and rain. Dave, Kai, and I moved methodically through our assigned sector, calling out for the missing hikers and checking areas where they might have sought shelter. 4 hours into the search, we had found nothing. No discarded equipment, no trail markers, no signs of disturbance in the undergrowth. This doesn't make sense, Dave muttered as we paused to consult our map. If they continued on the trail, they should have reached the junction by nightfall. If they went off trail, we should see some evidence. I nodded, studying the contour lines on the map. There's a ravine about half a mile east. They might have descended looking for water. Worth checking, Key agreed. As we changed direction, I noticed something unusual. A silence had fallen over the forest. The constant background chorus of birds and insects had ceased, as if someone had abruptly thrown a switch. Dave and Kai seemed not to notice, continuing to scan the ground for signs of the missing hikers. But I felt it, that same prickling sensation along my spine that I'd experienced before. We were being watched. I slowed my pace, scanning the tree line methodically. Nothing moved. The forest stood unnaturally still around us, the only sound our boots crunching against fallen leaves. Then I saw it. A dark shadow moving between distant trees, too large and too fluid to be a bear. It disappeared before I could focus clearly. Did you see that? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Dave turned, following my gaze. See what? Movement between those hemlocks about 50 yards out. He squinted, then shook his head. Could be our missing hikers. Let's check it out. As we approached the spot where I'd seen the movement, I found the first piece of evidence, a hiking boot, women's size 8, partially hidden beneath a fallen log. There was no blood, no signs of struggle, just an abandoned boot as if it had been casually discarded. That's odd, she said, examining the boot. Why would someone take off a single boot in terrain like this? I was about to respond when we heard it. A long, low moan that echoed through the trees, rising in pitch until it became almost a howl before abruptly cutting off. It wasn't human, nor was it any animal sound I'd ever heard in these woods. Dave's face paled. What the hell was that? Not sure, I replied, trying to maintain professional composure despite the chill that ran through me. Could be the wind through the ravine. But we all knew it wasn't the wind. The air was still heavy with anticipation. We radioed our position and the discovery of the boot to Marcus, who instructed us to continue searching the immediate area. As we spread out in a standard search pattern, maintaining visual contact with each other, I found myself drawn deeper into the forest, toward a dense stand of ancient trees that seemed darker than their surroundings. That's when I saw the footprint, massive, at least 16 inches long, pressed deep into the soft earth beside a small stream. It was roughly humanoid in shape, but too large to belong to any person. The impression showed 5 distinct toes in an arch, like a gigantic, bare human foot. My grandmother's stories flooded back to me. Tzul'Kulu, the slant-eyed giant, the forest guardian, the keeper of the game, some called him Bigfoot. I crouched to examine the print more closely, careful not to disturb it. The edges were crisp, recently made. Whatever had left this track had passed through very recently, perhaps within the hour. Dave, I called softly. Kai, you need to see this. No response. I looked up, scanning the area where my companions should have been visible. Nothing. The forest seemed to close in around me, the ancient trees standing sentinel like silent witnesses to something I couldn't comprehend. Dave, Kai, I called again, louder this time, fighting to keep the edge of panic from my voice. Only silence answered. I drew my service pistol, more for comfort than protection. If what left that footprint was nearby, a 9M wouldn't offer much defense. I keyed my radio, trying to raise my teammates. Static. I tried again, switching channels to reach base camp. More static, punctuated by bursts of what sounded like distant, distorted voices. I couldn't make out any words. Forcing myself to breathe evenly, I considered my options. Standard procedure dictated that separated team members should return to their last known shared position. That would mean backtracking to where we'd found the boot. As I turned to retrace my steps, a strange sound stopped me, soft rhythmic tapping, like wood striking wood. It seemed to come from multiple directions at once, surrounding me. Between the taps, I could swear I heard whispering. Too faint to discern words, but distinctly human-like. The stories said Tzul'Kulu could imitate human voices to lure the unwary deeper into his domain. My training battled with primal fear as I fought the urge to run. Running in the forest was dangerous, easy to trip, fall, become disoriented. Instead, I moved deliberately, scanning my surroundings with each step. Occasionally, branches would crack in the distance, as if something large moved parallel to my path. I gripped my pistol tighter, though I had no intention of firing blindly into the woods. After what seemed like hours but was likely only minutes, I reached the fallen log where we discovered the boot. There was no sign of Dave or Chi, no evidence they'd returned to this position. The boot itself was gone. That's when I heard the scream, unmistakably human, a woman's voice, high and terrified, cutting through the forest from somewhere to the east. It ended abruptly, as if something had silenced it mid-cry. I ran toward the sound, professionalism temporarily overcome by the urgent need to help. The terrain grew increasingly difficult. Fallen trees, rock outcroppings, dense undergrowth that tore up my uniform. I pushed through, ignoring the scratches and bruises accumulating on my exposed skin. The forest opened suddenly into a small clearing, perfectly circular, as if carved deliberately from the surrounding wilderness. In the center stood a massive oak tree, its trunk easily 10 feet in diameter, branches spreading in a canopy overhead. At its base lay the missing hiker's backpacks arranged neatly side by side. I approached cautiously, scanning the clearing for any sign of movement. The backpacks appeared untouched, zippers closed, no signs of damage. I called out again for the missing hikers, my voice sounding small and insignificant in the oppressive silence of the clearing. As I reached for the nearest pack, a gust of wind swept through the clearing, carrying with it a powerful musky odor that burned my nostrils and made my eyes water. It was the smell of something wild, something primal, not the familiar scent of bear or deer or any forest creature I knew. The branches of the great oak began to sway, though the wind had already passed, and from deep within the canopy came a low, rumbling growl that reverberated through my chest. I looked up, pistol raised, and for a brief moment caught sight of 2 reflective eyes staring down at me from between the leaves. Eyes that gleamed with an intelligence that was neither human nor animal. In that moment, I knew I was face to face with the guardian of the forest, the being my ancestors had respected and feared for generations. And I understood, with absolute certainty, that I was trespassing in its domain. 2 days had passed since our initial search, and still no sign of the missing hikers. The search had expanded to include over 50 personnel, including Forest Service employees, local police, and volunteers from surrounding communities. Helicopters with thermal imaging equipment scanned the forest from above, while tracking dogs worked the ground. Dave and Key had been found safely. They'd become separated from me when a sudden, localized fog had rolled in, obscuring visibility to mere feet. They reported experiencing the same eerie silence I had noticed, but neither had seen the footprint or heard the strange tapping sounds that had followed me. "Yeah, you look like hell," Marcus commented as I checked in at the command post established near Bald River Falls. "When's the last time you slept?" I rubbed my face, feeling the stubble that had accumulated over the past 48 hours. I grabbed a few hours last night. That was technically true, though those few hours had been restless, filled with dreams of massive shadows moving through the trees and strange whispering voices calling my Cherokee name. Marcus frowned. "Take a break. You're no good to anyone if you collapse from exhaustion." "I'm fine," I insisted. "Any new leads?" He shook his head. "Nothing solid. Dogs lost the scent about half a mile from where you found that boot. Speaking of which, we haven't located it again either." I nodded unsurprised. The boot's disappearance had been documented in the official report, though I suspected most assumed it had simply been misplaced in the confusion of the search. "What about the footprint I found?" Marcus's expression tightened slightly. "The rain washed it away before the evidence team could document it properly. All they have is your description and rough measurements." I could tell from his tone that my report of a 16-inch humanoid footprint had raised eyebrows. Without physical evidence, it would likely be dismissed as a misidentification, perhaps a distorted bear track or overlapping deer prints. "I know what I saw, Marcus. I'm not saying you didn't see something, Anoli. But we need to focus on finding these hikers, not chasing folklore. His words stung, though I understood his position. As team lead, Marcus needed to maintain focus on the concrete aspects of the search. Last known locations, survivability timelines, terrain challenges. He couldn't afford to entertain notions of forest guardians or mythical beings, no matter how deeply such beliefs ran in the local culture. I want to check the eastern ravine again, I said, changing the subject. There are some caves along the lower section that we haven't fully explored. Marcus consulted his map. That's outside our primary search zone now. The probability models suggest. The models don't account for everything. I interrupted. There's something not right about this case, Marcus. These aren't inexperienced hikers who wandered off trail. They vanished along with some of their gear while the rest was left neatly arranged. That doesn't fit any pattern I've seen in 15 years of SAR operations. He studied me for a long moment, then sighed. Take Rivera with you. Stay in radio contact and be back before dark. If you find nothing by then, I want you to take 24 hours off. That's an order. I nodded, accepting the compromise. Carlos Rivera was a good ranger, level-headed and observant. He was also new enough to the area that he hadn't yet formed opinions about local legends or the possibility of unexplained phenomena in the forest. We set out immediately, hiking through terrain that had grown familiar over the past 2 days of searching. The weather had finally cleared after overnight rain, leaving the forest damp and glistening in the mid-morning sun. Birds had returned to the canopy, their calls creating a reassuring backdrop to our journey. So what exactly are we looking for? Carlos asked as we descended toward the ravine. The other teams have already swept this area. They were looking for people, I replied. I'm looking for signs that something else might be involved. Something else? His tone was curious rather than dismissive. I chose my words carefully. The Cherokee have stories about a being that protects these forests, e.g. the Great Hunter. Some people would call it Bigfoot. Carlos was silent for a moment. You think that's what we're dealing with? I don't know, I admitted. But I saw a footprint no human could have made, and I heard sounds I can't explain. I owe it to those missing hikers to consider every possibility. He nodded slowly. My grandmother in Puerto Rico used to tell stories about beings in the El Yank rainforest that would lead travelers astray. I always thought they were just tales to keep children from wandering too far. Maybe all legends have some basis in truth, I suggested. We reached the bottom of the ravine, where a small stream wound its way through moss-covered rocks. The cave systems I wanted to check were about a quarter-mile downstream, natural formations in the limestone that had been shaped by centuries of water erosion. As we followed the stream, I noticed something unusual. Perfect silence had fallen again, just as it had during my previous encounter. The birds had ceased their calls, the insects their buzzing. Even the stream seemed to flow more quietly, as if trying not to draw attention. Do you notice that? I whispered to Carlos. He nodded, his hand moving instinctively to the sidearm at his hip. What is it? I don't know, but stay alert. We continued forward more cautiously, scanning our surroundings with each step. The caves came into view ahead, dark openings in the ravine wall, partially obscured by hanging vines and ferns. As we approached, I detected the same musky odor I'd encountered in the clearing 2 days earlier. You smell that? I asked Carlos. He wrinkled his nose. Yeah. Smells like, I don't know. Not a bear or cat, something different. I nodded, drawing my flashlight. Let's check the caves, stay close. The first cave was shallow, extending only about 20 feet into the ravine wall before ending in a jumble of fallen rocks. Nothing unusual, no signs of recent human presence. The second was similar, though slightly deeper, with a small pool of collected water at its rear. It was the third cave that made my skin crawl. From the outside, it appeared unremarkable, an opening about 7 feet high and 5 feet wide. But as soon as we stepped inside, the temperature dropped noticeably. Our flashlight beams revealed a tunnel extending deeper into the earth than the previous caves, its walls smooth and eerily regular, as if they had been intentionally shaped. This doesn't look natural, Carlos murmured, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. No, I agreed. It doesn't. About 30 feet in, the tunnel widened into a chamber roughly 20 feet in diameter. Our flashlights illuminated walls covered in what appeared to be claw marks. Long, parallel grooves carved into the stone. Some looked ancient, others disturbingly fresh. In the center of the chamber lay a pile of items that instantly raised the hair on the back of my neck. A collection of hiking gear, clothing, cameras, watches, and other personal effects. Some appeared weathered and damaged, while others looked relatively new. Among them, I immediately spotted a woman's hiking boot that matched the one we'd found earlier. "My God," Carlos breathed. "How long has this been here?" I crouched beside the pile, carefully examining items without touching them. Some of these looked decades old. I pointed to a film camera of a style not commonly used since the 1980s. Others are recent. My flashlight illuminated a smartphone in a protective case, its screen cracked but the device itself intact. "We need to document this and call it in," Carlos said, reaching for his radio. Before he could transmit, a low growl emanated from deeper within the cave. From a tunnel opening we hadn't noticed on the far side of the chamber. It was the same sound I'd heard in the oak tree clearing, deep rumbling and undeniably threatening. Carlos froze, radio halfway to his mouth. "What was that?" "We need to leave," I said quietly, slowly rising to my feet. "Now." The growl came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of something large moving in the darkness beyond the second tunnel. My flashlight beam caught a glimpse of movement. Something massive and dark withdrawing further into the passage. We backed toward the entrance, weapons drawn but not fired. I had no desire to discharge a firearm in the confined space of the cave, where ricochets could be as dangerous as whatever lurked in the darkness. Just as we reached the mouth of the cave, a scream echoed from the depths, the same woman's scream I had heard days earlier, but this time accompanied by a man's voice shouting, "Run! For God's sake, run!" Carlos turned, instinctively moving toward the sounds of distress. I grabbed his arm. Wait, there are people in there," he protested. "Listen," I urged. The screams had changed, becoming rhythmic, almost melodic. They no longer sounded like expressions of terror, but rather like imitations, as if something was replicating human distress calls without understanding their meaning. Carlos's eyes widened as he realized what we were hearing. What the hell could do that? "I don't know," I admitted, "but we're not equipped to handle it. We need to return to base and bring back a properly prepared team." He nodded reluctantly, and we retreated from the cave entrance, maintaining visual contact with it until we'd put several hundred yards between ourselves and the ravine wall. Only then did Carlos key his radio to report our findings. Static answered him. He tried again, adjusting the frequency. More static, along with the same distant, distorted voices I'd heard during my previous experience. "Communications are being disrupted somehow," I said. "We need to get to higher ground." We began the steep climb out of the ravine, the silence of the forest persisting around us. Halfway up, Carlos paused, looking back toward the caves. "Inoli," he said, his voice tight. "Look." I turned to see a figure emerging from the cave we'd just fled, a massive bipedal form silhouetted against the lighter background of the ravine wall. Even at this distance, I could tell it stood at least 8 feet tall, its broad shoulders and powerful build unmistakably non-human despite its upright posture. It paused at the cave entrance, seeming to survey the ravine, then tilted its head back in what appeared to be a sniffing motion. It was tracking us. "Move," I urged Carlos, quickly but quietly. We continued our ascent, moving as rapidly as the difficult terrain allowed. I resisted the urge to look back, focusing instead on finding secure handholds and footholds in the steep ravine wall. The sound of our breathing and the occasional dislodged stone seemed unnaturally loud in the persistent silence. When we finally reached the top of the ravine, I chanced to look back. The figure was no longer visible at the cave entrance, which could mean either that it had returned to the depths or, more concerning, that it was moving through the ravine, following our trail. "We need to get back to the command post," I said. "Different route than we came. Try to break the trail." Carlos nodded, his face pale but determined. We set off at a fast pace, choosing a path that would take us along rocky ground, where tracks would be minimal, occasionally doubling back or creating false trails that a pursuer might follow. The forest remained unnervingly silent around us. The only sounds are controlled breathing and the soft crunch of our boots on the forest floor. Twice I thought I heard the cracking of branches behind us, but when we paused to listen, there was only silence. After nearly an hour of hard hiking, we emerged onto one of the Forest Service roads about 2 miles from the command post. Carlos tried his radio again, and this time made contact, though the connection was staticky and intermittent. "Base, this is Rivera. Do you copy?" "Over. Copy. Location?" Marcus's voice broke through the interference. "We're on Forest Road 87, about 2 miles south of base. We found something significant. Requesting immediate backup. Over. Nature of findings. Over. Findings over." Carlos looked at me, unsure how to describe what we discovered without sounding delusional. I took the radio. "Marcus, this is a dare. We've located a cache of personal effects that may belong to multiple missing persons, including the Townsends. We've also encountered a situation that requires additional personnel and equipment. Not safe to elaborate via radio. We're returning to base now. Over." There was a pause before Marcus responded, his voice clearer now as we continued moving toward the command post. "Understood. We'll have a team ready for debrief. Debrief. Proceed with caution. Over." We continued along the road, moving at a steady jog now that we were on even terrain. The silence had finally broken, the normal sounds of the forest gradually returning around us. Birds called from the canopy, insects buzzed in the underbrush. Whatever presence had been tracking us seemed to have withdrawn. As we rounded a bend in the road, Carlos suddenly stopped, staring at something ahead. I followed his gaze and felt my blood run cold. Standing in the middle of the road, approximately 50 yards ahead of us, was a man, disheveled, clothing torn, face gaunt and pale. It took me a moment to recognize him from the photographs we'd been given. James Townsend, one of our missing hikers. He didn't move as we approached, didn't respond to our calls. He simply stood, swaying slightly, his eyes fixed on something in the forest to our right. "Mr. Townsend?" I called, moving closer with caution. "James? Are you hurt?" No response. His eyes remained unfocused, his expression blank. "Yes." We reached him, and I could see now that his clothes were not just torn but shredded in places, as if by enormous claws. Dried blood caked his left arm, though there was no visible wound beneath. His boots were missing, his bare feet cut and bruised. "James," I said again, touching his shoulder gently. "Can you hear me? Where's Melissa?" At the mention of his wife's name, his eyes finally focused on me. His lips moved, forming words, but no sound emerged. I leaned closer. "What happened to you?" I asked. "Where have you been?" He shuddered, then whispered a single phrase that chilled me to the bone. "It keeps her. It wants me to bring more." Before I could ask what he meant, his eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed. Carlos and I caught him before he hit the ground, lowering him gently to the road surface. His pulse was rapid but steady, his breathing shallow. "We need to get him to medical attention," Carlos said, already reaching for his emergency kit. I nodded, to position James more comfortably while Carlos retrieved a thermal blanket to ward off shock. As I adjusted the unconscious man's head, I noticed something behind his right ear, a small circular mark like a brand or burn in the shape of a spiral with a central eye. It was a symbol I recognized from my grandmother's stories, the mark of Tzul'Kolu, said to be placed on those who had encountered the forest guardian and been allowed to live as a warning to others. I didn't point it out to Carlos. Some things were better left undocumented in official reports, at least until I could better understand what we were dealing with. As we prepared James for transport back to the command post, I scanned the forest edge where he had been staring. For a brief moment, I thought I saw movement among the trees, a massive, dark shape withdrawing into the shadows, but when I blinked, it was gone, leaving me to wonder if it had been there at all. James Townsend had been found alive against all odds after nearly 3 days missing in rugged wilderness. But his wife remained unaccounted for, and his cryptic words, "It keeps her. It wants me to bring more," suggested a horror I was only beginning to comprehend. The forest held secrets older than human memory, and something ancient and powerful had awakened within it, something that, according to my ancestors, had protected these mountains since time immemorial. Something that now viewed humans as intruders to be dealt with, or perhaps as offerings to be collected. As we carefully lifted James to carry him back to base, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't rescuing him at all. We were simply retrieving a messenger, sent to deliver a warning from the true guardian of the forest, and I feared that I, with my Cherokee blood and ancestral connection to these lands, was somehow meant to be part of whatever was unfolding in these ancient woods. Franze. The fluorescent lights of Mountain Regional Hospital cast harsh shadows across James Townsend's face as he lay unconscious, monitors beeping steadily beside his bed. It had been 12 hours since Carlos and I had found him on the forest road, and he had yet to regain consciousness. The doctors were puzzled by his condition. Physically, aside from dehydration, minor cuts and bruises, he appeared unharmed, yet he remained unresponsive, his brain activity showing patterns consistent with deep traumatic shock. I sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair beside his bed, ostensibly to monitor him for any statements about his missing wife, but in reality because I couldn't bring myself to leave. The symbol behind his ear, the spiral with the central eye, haunted me. I had seen it once before, etched into a stone tablet my grandmother kept wrapped in deerskin and hidden in a cedar box. She had shown it to me only once, when I was 12 years old, explaining that it was a warning passed down through generations. "This is the mark of Tsul Kalu," she had said, her finger tracing the spiral without touching the stone. "If you ever see it, know that the balance has been disturbed." The door to the hospital room opened, and Marcus entered, his expression grim. "Any change?" he asked, nodding toward James. I shook my head. "Doctors say he's stable, but showing no signs of waking soon." Marcus sighed, pulling up a second chair. "We've got a problem in Inoli." The evidence team returned from the cave you and Rivera found. And there was nothing there. No pile of personal effects, no claw marks on the walls. Just an ordinary limestone cave that extends about 30 feet before ending in a rock fall. I stared at him, processing his words. "That's impossible. Carlos and I both saw it. The tunnel, the chamber, the collection of items." "I believe you saw something," Marcus said carefully. "But when the team arrived, there was nothing to document. They took photographs to prove it." He handed me his tablet, open to a folder of images. I swiped through them slowly, my disbelief growing with each one. The cave entrance was recognizable as the one Carlos and I had entered, but the interior was completely different. A natural formation with rough walls that narrowed as it extended into the ravine, ending in a jumble of fallen rock. No smooth-walled tunnel, no chamber, no pile of personal belongings. "This doesn't make sense," I muttered, returning the tablet. "We both saw it, Marcus. It was real." He studied me for a moment. "The stress of the search, the pressure to find these people, it can affect perception. It can affect perception. We've all experienced it at some point." "Are you suggesting we hallucinated the entire thing? Both of us simultaneously, with the exact same details?" "I'm suggesting there might be a psychological explanation that makes more sense than a supernatural one," he replied evenly. "Think about it, Inoli. You grew up with Cherokee legends about forest guardians. Carlos admitted he'd heard similar stories from his own cultural background. Under stress, the mind can construct experiences that align with deeply ingrained beliefs." I wanted to argue, to insist on the reality of what we'd witnessed, but I knew how it would sound. Two rangers claiming to have found a cave full of missing persons' belongings that vanished before it could be documented, along with a massive humanoid creature that left no tracks or other evidence of its existence. It would end with psychological evaluations and desk duty, not a continued search for Melissa Townsend. "What about James?" I asked instead, gesturing to the unconscious man. "He didn't just appear on that road by coincidence. Something kept him for 3 days and then released him deliberately with a message." "What message?" I hesitated, then repeated James's words. "It keeps her. It wants me to bring more." Marcus frowned. "That could mean anything. He was severely dehydrated, probably delirious. We can't base an investigation on the ramblings of a man in shock." "And the mark behind his ear?" I challenged. "The spiral with the eye?" "The doctors noted it in their report. It appears to be an old scar, possibly from childhood, not a recent injury." I knew better but said nothing. Arguing would only entrench Marcus further in his skepticism. "Look," he continued, his tone softening, "I know these forests mean something special to you. Your heritage, your connection to the land, I respect that. But as search coordinator, I have to focus on verifiable facts and established protocols. We have one missing hiker still unaccounted for, and limited resources to find her. So what's the plan?" "We're scaling back the operation. Melissa Townsend has been missing for nearly 72 hours now. Survival probability is decreasing rapidly. We'll maintain a presence in the primary search zone for another 48 hours, but after that, he didn't need to finish. After 5 days, search and rescue operations typically transition to recovery efforts, operating on the assumption that the missing person had not survived. I want to continue searching, I said, specifically in the area around that cave, regardless of what the evidence team found or didn't find. Marcus studied me, concern evident in his expression. You're exhausted, Anoli. You've been pushing yourself too hard. Take the 24 hours off that I ordered yesterday. Get some rest, clear your head. Then if you still want to continue, we'll discuss it. It wasn't a request. The look in his eyes made that clear. I nodded reluctantly, knowing that arguing would only delay my return to the forest. Fine, 24 hours. But then I'm going back out. Fair enough. Fair enough. Fair enough. I'll have Rivera cover your sector until then. After Marcus left, I remained at James's bedside a while longer, watching his face for any sign of returning consciousness. The steady rhythm of the monitors was hypnotic, almost soothing after days of tension and adrenaline. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, a hand gripped my wrist with surprising strength. I jerked awake to find James Townsend sitting upright in bed, his eyes wide and focused directly on me. The monitors beside him beeped frantically as his heart rate accelerated. You've seen it, he whispered, his voice hoarse. I can tell. You've seen the Guardian. I glanced toward the door, ensuring we were alone, then nodded slowly. Yes. In the forest and again at the cave, he repeated, his grip tightened. It took us there after it separated us from our group. Made us think we were following a trail back to the falls, but we ended up deep in the ravine instead. What happened in the cave, James? Where's Melissa? His eyes filled with tears. It kept her. Said it needed a female to complete something. A ritual. Said the forest was sick. Dying needed to be renewed. Spoke to you? I asked, surprised. Not with words in my head. Images, feelings. But I understood. He raised a trembling hand to the mark behind his ear. It marked me as a messenger. Said I need to bring others. Offerings. Offerings. Human offerings. He nodded, his expression haunted. It's been taking people for generations, but never enough. The forest keeps shrinking, keeps getting weaker. It needs more now. A chill ran through me as I recalled my grandmother's warnings about Sul Kalu. The stories always portrayed him as a guardian, sometimes fearsome, but ultimately protective of the forest and those who respected it. Never as something that demanded human sacrifices. The being you encountered, I said carefully. Can you describe it? James shuddered. Massive, 8, maybe 9 feet tall, covered in dark hair, but not like an animal. More like a man with a pellet's face. He trailed off, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow. Its face? Face? I prompted gently, almost human but not. Eyes deep set, intelligent. Knew things about me, about my life, just by looking at me. And its hands. 5 fingers like ours, but huge, powerful. The description matched what Carlos and I had glimpsed, as well as the traditional accounts of Tzul'Kalu from Cherokee legends. James, listen to me. This is important. Did it tell you where it was keeping Melissa? Is she still alive? He nodded frantically. Alive, yes. It needs her alive for the ritual, but it won't wait long. 3 days from when it released me. If I don't bring more offerings by then, where, James? Where's it keeping her? The heart of the forest, he whispered, where the oldest trees still stand. A place humans haven't touched for centuries. His eyes widened suddenly, looking past me toward the door. It knows I'm telling you this. It can see through my eyes, hear through my ear. Before I could respond, James began to convulse, his back arching off the bed as the monitors beside him blared with alarms. I reached for the emergency call button, but before I could press it, James grabbed my wrist again, pulling me close with surprising strength. The mark, he gasped between spasms. You're chosen too. It wants you to understand, to help. Your blood, your bloodline. Medical staff burst into the room, pushing me aside as they worked to stabilize James. A nurse ushered me into the hallway where I stood, shaken, trying to process what I'd just heard. The oldest part of the forest, a place humans hadn't touched for centuries. I knew exactly where that was. A section of old-growth forest in the northern region, one of the few areas that had never been logged. The Cherokee had considered it sacred ground, and through various treaties and arrangements, it had remained untouched even as surrounding areas were developed. And James's final words, about my bloodline, echoed what I had already begun to suspect. My Cherokee heritage somehow connected me to what was happening, I was in some way I didn't yet understand. Part of this. A doctor emerged from James's room looking grim. "Are you family?" he asked. "No. Forest Service. I found him." "I see. Well, he's stabilized for now, but I've ordered additional tests. The seizure was severe, and there may be neurological damage. If what you've described is accurate, then what you're dealing with may not be Tsul Kulu at all, but something that has taken his form." "What do you mean?" "In our traditions, there are beings known as shapeshifters, spirits that can assume the appearance of other entities, including sacred guardians. They are typically malevolent, seeking to disrupt the balance between worlds. Why would such a being appear now? And why would it target hikers in the national forest?" Joseph rose, moving to a bookshelf where he selected an old leather-bound volume. "There have been disturbances in the spiritual balance of these mountains for decades. Logging, mining, development. But in recent years, something more significant has occurred." He opened the book, revealing handwritten pages in Cherokee syllabary. This is a record kept by keepers of tradition since the 1800s. It documents spiritual disturbances and appearances of beings from the other world. His finger traced the syllabary until he found what he was looking for. Here, 3 years ago, a mining company conducted exploratory drilling in the northern section of what is now the National Forest. They were searching for rare earth elements. According to this record, the drilling disturbed an ancient burial site, not a human one, but a place where powerful spirits were bound centuries ago by Cherokee medicine people. Bound spirits like demons? Not exactly. More like forces of nature that had become corrupted, unbalanced. Our ancestors recognized that these forces, if left unchecked, would cause harm to both the land and its people. Or for the land and its people, make spirits to specific locations, using sacred objects and symbols to contain their power. Ways and symbols to contain their power. A thought occurred to me. The spiral with the eye, the mark that appeared on James and then vanished. What does it mean? Joseph's expression became even more serious. It is a containment symbol used in binding ceremonies. Its appearance suggests that whatever was bound is now attempting to reassert itself, to break free of its constraints, and it needs human offerings to do so, I concluded. But why mark James? Why send him back as a messenger? "The binding ceremony requires blood from the lineage that performed it," Joseph explained. "The original binding would have been performed by Cherokee medicine people, likely including your ancestors. The entity needs blood from that same lineage to undo the binding." "My blood," I said quietly, remembering James's words. "It wants my blood, my participation in whatever ritual it's planning." Joseph nodded gravely. "You are of the Adair line, descendants of those who helped bind these forces originally. The entity is likely trying to manipulate you into participating in its liberation, using the missing woman as leverage. Then I need to find her, to stop whatever is happening before this entity breaks free completely. It's not that simple, Inoli." Confronting such a being directly is extremely dangerous. It has powers beyond the physical world, the ability to manipulate perceptions, to influence minds, to move between realms. I can't just abandon Melissa Townsend, I insisted. And if this entity continues to gain strength, more people will disappear. I have a responsibility, both as a forest ranger and as a Cherokee. Joseph studied me for a long moment, then sighed. "You are as stubborn as your grandmother. She would say the same thing." He closed the book and returned it to the shelf. "If you're determined to confront this being, you'll need protection, spiritual and physical." He moved to a cabinet in the corner of his office, unlocking it with a small key he wore around his neck. From inside, he withdrew a buckskin pouch and a small carved wooden box. This pouch contains sacred herbs, tobacco, sage, sweetgrass, and cedar, the 4 sacred plants of purification and protection. The trees were becoming larger, more ancient, massive trunks covered in moss, branches forming a cathedral-like canopy overhead, the underbrush then giving way to a forest floor carpeted with ferns and fungi that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. I paused beside a particularly massive oak tree, its trunk easily 10 feet in diameter. Placing my hand against the rough bark, I felt a vibration, almost like a heartbeat, pulsing slowly beneath my palm. The forest was alive in a way I had never experienced before, conscious and aware of my presence. As I stood there, catching my breath and orienting myself, a sound broke the silence, a low melodic humming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It resonated in my chest, making the pendant around my neck vibrate in response. I extinguished my flashlight, allowing my eyes to adjust to the darkness. Gradually, I became aware of a faint luminescence ahead, a soft blue-green glow filtering through the trees. Moving cautiously toward it, I found myself approaching a clearing similar to the one where I had discovered the hiker's backpacks days earlier. But this clearing was different, larger, perfectly circular, and dominated by a massive stone formation at its center. The stones were arranged in a spiral pattern, rising from ground level at the outer edge to nearly 10 feet high at the center. The blue-green light emanated from within the spiral, casting eerie shadows across the clearing. I crouched at the edge of the trees, observing. The humming sound was louder here, resolving into what might have been words in a language I didn't recognize but somehow understood at a primal level. It was a chant, a calling, an invitation. Movement caught my eye, a figure emerging from the forest on the opposite side of the clearing. Even in the dim light, I recognized James Townsend, moving with a stiff puppet-like gait that suggested he was not in control of his own body. His eyes reflected the eerie light, glowing unnaturally. Behind him came another figure, then another, local residents I recognized from the nearby town. Each moved with the same unnatural gait, their expressions blank, their movements synchronized. All bore the spiral mark, visible as glowing symbols on their exposed skin. I counted 12 in total, forming a circle around the stone spiral. As they took their positions, the humming intensified, and the light from the center of the spiral brightened. Then I saw her, Melissa Townsend, emerging from within the stone spiral. She appeared unharmed but moved with the same mechanical precision as the others. Her clothing was gone, replaced by what appeared to be a garment made of woven grass and flowers. The spiral mark glowed brightly on her forehead. As she reached the top of the spiral, a new figure appeared, massive, towering over the humans gathered below. It resembled the descriptions of Tzul'kalu from Cherokee legends, 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair, with a face that blended human and animal features. But there was something wrong, something distorted about its appearance, as if I were seeing it through rippling water. The pendant against my chest burned painfully now, and I felt a pressure in my mind, an intrusive presence trying to push its way into my thoughts. I clutched the stone tightly, focusing on Joseph's teachings about mental shields and protection. The entity at the center of the spiral suddenly stiffened, its head turning in my direction. Though I remained hidden in the shadows, I knew it had sensed my presence. "Come forward, Keeper." It spoke, its voice deep and resonant, echoing through the clearing and inside my mind simultaneously. "Your blood is needed to complete the ritual." I remained still, silent, fighting the compulsion to obey that accompanied its words. "You cannot resist what you are," it continued. "The forest calls to your blood, as it has called to your lineage for generations. Come and fulfill your purpose." When I still didn't move, the entity made a gesture toward Melissa Townsend. She cried out in pain, falling to her knees atop the stone spiral. "Each moment you delay brings her closer to death," the entity said. "Listen, I have been patient, waiting centuries for the proper alignment. But my patience ends tonight." I stood slowly, stepping into the clearing but maintaining distance from the circle of entranced humans. "Release her," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. She has no part in this. The entity made a sound that might have been laughter. "All humans who enter my domain have a part to play. Some as vessels, some as sustenance, some as sacrifice. She has been chosen for a greater purpose, to house the essence of my mate, to begin the renewal." Renewal of what? The old ways. The true balance, before your kind forgot their place in the order of things. The entity descended several steps, moving closer to me. "Your ancestors understood. They made offerings, showed proper reverence. In return, we protected the land, ensured fertility and abundance." "My ancestors bound you," I countered, recalling Joseph's words. "They recognized you as a corrupted force, a threat to the true balance." The entity's expression darkened, the features shifting to something less human, more bestial. "They betrayed us, made promises they did not keep, accepted our gifts, then turned to new gods, new ways." So this is revenge? Taking hikers, tourists, innocent people who know nothing of ancient pacts? Not revenge. Necessity. It gestured broadly, encompassing the forest around us. The binding weakens as the old knowledge fades. Few remain who remember the proper ceremonies, the true names. Without renewal, this forest will die. All forest will die. The balance between your world and mine will collapse. I sensed truth in its words, or at least what it believed to be truth. The entity, whatever it truly was, perceived itself as a necessary force for maintaining some cosmic balance, not as a malevolent kidnapper of humans. If what you say is true, I said carefully, then there must be a way to restore this balance without taking human lives. My ancestors found a way. Your ancestors gave their own life force willingly, the entity interrupted. Are you prepared to do the same? To surrender years of your existence to strengthen the boundaries between worlds? The question echoed what Joseph had told me about the original binding ceremony. The medicine people who performed it had lived shortened lives as a result of their sacrifice. If that's what's required, I said, meeting the entity's gaze directly. But first, release Melissa Townsend and the others you've entranced. They have no part in this agreement. The entity studied me for a long moment, its ancient eyes seeming to peer directly into my soul. Your offer is accepted, Keeper. But know this, once begun, the ceremony cannot be halted. The price must be paid in full. Price must be paid in. It made another gesture, and Melissa collapsed completely, as did the 12 entranced figures around the clearing. They lay motionless, though I could see they still breathed. They will awaken with no memory of this place, of me, of the calling that brought them here, the entity said. But you and I have business yet unfinished. It extended a massive hand toward me, beckoning. Come. The renewal must be completed before dawn. Every instinct warned against approaching the entity, against participating in whatever ceremony it intended. But the pendant against my chest had cooled, no longer burning with warning, and somehow I knew that this was indeed my purpose. The reason I had been drawn to become a ranger in these specific mountains, the reason I felt such a deep connection to the forest. I stepped forward, moving past the unconscious forms of the entranced humans, approaching the stone spiral. As I did, I felt a shift in the air around me, a thinning of the boundary between physical reality and something else, another dimension or plane of existence overlapping with our own. Your ancestors called me Tsul Kolu, the entity said as I climbed the first stones of the spiral. The first stones of the spiral? But that is merely one face, one aspect of what I truly am. I am the guardian of thresholds, the keeper of boundaries between worlds. And what has weakened these boundaries? I asked, continuing to ascend the spiral. What has caused the imbalance you speak of? Human forgetfulness. Human carelessness. The entity's form seemed to flicker, sometimes appearing solid, sometimes translucent. The old ways included recognition of the sacred, respect for the powers that maintain the world's structure. As belief faded, so did the strength of the boundaries. I reached the top of the spiral, standing face to face with the entity. This close, I could see that what appeared to be hair covering its body was actually a complex pattern of symbols similar to the spiral mark, flowing and shifting across its skin like living tattoos. What must I do? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Give freely what your ancestors gave, it replied. Life force freely offered to strengthen the binding that maintains balance. And how is this done? In answer, the entity extended one massive hand, palm up. In the center was a small, extremely sharp stone knife, its edge gleaming in the eerie light. Blood of the lineage freely given upon the keystone. It gestured to a flat stone at our feet, marked with the spiral and ice symbol. With words of binding that your blood remembers, though your mind may not. I took the knife, its weight surprisingly light in my hand. The handle was warm, as if recently held by living hands. How much blood? I asked practically. Until the binding is complete. Until the balance is restored. That was worryingly vague, but I sensed I would get no clearer answer. I knelt beside the keystone, knife in hand, trying to recall if Joseph had mentioned anything about the specific ritual. He hadn't, expecting to teach me the following day. But as I positioned the blade against my palm, words rose unbidden to my lips, Cherokee syllables I didn't consciously know but somehow remembered, as if they had been encoded in my DNA, passed down through generations of my bloodline. I began to chant softly, the words flowing naturally, telling of balance and boundaries, of respect and reciprocity between worlds. As the chant intensified, I drew the blade across my palm, allowing blood to drip onto the keystone. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The stone absorbed the blood like a sponge, the spiral symbol beginning to glow with the same blue-green light that illuminated the clearing. The entity opposite me seemed to solidify, becoming more definitively present in this reality. Continue, it urged, its voice stronger now. The binding strengthens. I maintained the chant, allowing more blood to flow onto the stone. A curious sensation spread through my body. Not pain, but a gradual draining, as if something more fundamental than blood was flowing from me into the stone. The forest around us responded, the ancient trees swaying though there was no wind, their branches reaching toward the stone spiral as if drawn by an irresistible force. The ground itself seemed to pulse with life, roots visibly moving beneath the soil like awakening serpents. As my chant reached its crescendo, the entity underwent a transformation, the bestial aspects receding, the form becoming more definitively humanoid, though still massive and imposing. The shifting symbols on its skin stabilized, forming a permanent pattern that glowed with inner light and light. "It is done," it said finally. Its voice changed, deeper, more resonant, yet somehow less alien. "The binding is renewed, the balance restored." I slumped forward, suddenly exhausted beyond anything I had ever experienced. The knife fell from my nerveless fingers, clattering against the stone. Even breathing seemed to require enormous effort. "What have you taken?" I managed to ask. 20 years, the entity replied matter-of-factly, a fair exchange for the renewal of a binding that will last a century. 20 years of my life. The realization should have horrified me, but I felt only a strange acceptance, as if some part of me had always known this would be the price. "The forest will remember your sacrifice," the entity continued. "As will I. You have honored your ancestors' pact and secured the boundary between worlds for another generation." It extended a hand, touching my forehead gently. "Sleep now, Keeper. When you wake, you will find your way home." Darkness claimed me then, a deep and dreamless void that felt like falling through endless space. I awoke to morning sunlight filtering through the canopy, birds singing overhead. I lay on soft moss at the base of a massive oak tree, with no sign of the stone spiral, the clearing, or the entity I had encountered. But the evidence of the night's events remained, a healing cut across my palm, the pendant still around my neck, and a bone-deep weariness that made even sitting up a monumental effort. Somehow, I knew the entity had spoken truly. 20 years of my life had been given to renew the binding, to restore the balance between worlds. I would age faster now, my remaining time shortened by my willing sacrifice. Yet I felt no regret. The forest around me hummed with renewed vitality. The boundaries between worlds strengthened. Melissa Townsend and the others who had been entranced would be found, alive and unharmed, with no memory of their ordeal. As I finally managed to stand, leaning heavily against the oak for support, I noticed something at my feet, a small carved figure made of dark wood. It depicted a being half human, half beast, with the spiral and I symbol etched into its chest. A token, a remembrance, and perhaps a warning. The entity that my ancestors had called Sul Kulu was bound once more, the balance restored, but not forever. Eventually, another of my bloodline would need to renew the pact, to give of themselves to maintain the boundary between worlds. I pocketed the figure and began the long journey back through the forest. I was still a ranger, still a protector of these lands, though now I understood my role extended far beyond the mundane responsibilities of my job description. The forest had chosen me, as it had chosen my ancestors before me. And, despite the price, I had answered its call. 1 year had passed since that night in the forest. Melissa Townsend and the 12 entranced locals had been found as I expected, wandering dazed through the woods with no memory of where they'd been or what had happened to them. Medical examinations revealed nothing unusual except elevated levels of certain neurochemicals associated with trance states. The official report concluded that they had experienced a rare mass psychological event, possibly triggered by environmental factors such as fungal spores or gas emissions from underground deposits. The case was filed away, another unexplained incident in the annals of the Cherokee National Forest. I had taken a leave of absence following the search operation, citing exhaustion and stress. No one questioned this. I had pushed myself beyond reasonable limits during those intense days. When I returned to duty 3 months later, Marcus noted that I looked older somehow, more weathered, but attributed it to the strain I had undergone. He wasn't entirely wrong. The 20 years the entity had taken from me manifested not as immediate, dramatic aging, but as an acceleration of the natural process. Gray hairs appeared at my temples. Fine lines etched themselves around my eyes. Joint pain that shouldn't have troubled me until my 50s became a daily companion. Joseph Walking Stick was the only one who truly understood what had happened. When I returned the pendant to him and recounted the events of that night, he nodded solemnly, recognizing the sacrifice without needing it explained. "Your grandmother would be proud," he said simply. "You have honored the old ways, the true responsibility of your bloodline." Today, I stood on a ridge overlooking the northern section of the forest, the ancient trees swaying gently in the summer breeze. From this vantage point, I could see the general area where the stone spiral had appeared, though no trace of it remained visible from the air or ground. Geological surveys showed nothing unusual about the location, just ordinary forest floor covering ordinary bedrock. But I knew better. I felt the renewed strength of the binding, the restored balance between worlds. The forest was healthier than it had been in decades, trees growing with unusual vigor, wildlife populations rebounding, streams running clearer and more abundant. The carved figure the entity had left me remained in my pocket at all times, a constant reminder of the pact and my role as keeper. Sometimes at night, I would hold it in my palm and feel a faint resonance, a connection to something ancient and powerful that slumbered once more beneath the forest floor. I had told no one else the full truth of what had happened, not Carlos, who occasionally gave me curious glances when he thought I wasn't looking, not Marcus, who had been relieved when the missing hikers were found alive, and the case could be closed without further unexplained elements. Certainly not the Townsends who had moved to California shortly after their ordeal, seeking distance from the forest that had nearly claimed them. My solitude in this knowledge was part of the burden, part of the sacrifice. The secrets of the forest, of the boundaries between worlds, were not meant for casual sharing. They belonged to the bloodlines that had maintained them for generations, passed down in stories and ceremonies that the modern world had largely forgotten. As I turned to descend the ridge, heading back toward my ranger station, I caught a glimpse of movement among the distant trees. A tall, dark figure that might have been a shadow, might have been something more. It raised a hand in what seemed like salutation before melting back into the forest. Sulukalu, the guardian of the threshold, acknowledging the keeper who had renewed his binding. We were connected now, our fates intertwined through blood and sacrifice. For another century the balance would hold, the boundaries remained strong, and when that time neared its end, another of my bloodline would feel the calling, would be drawn to these ancient woods to continue the cycle that had begun centuries before Europeans set foot on this continent. The weight of 20 lost years rested on my shoulders, but with it came a profound understanding of my place in the order of things, not just as a park ranger protecting a tract of public land, but as a guardian of something far older and more significant than human designations could encompass. The forest had its protectors in both worlds now. And though the price had been high, I knew with absolute certainty that it had been worth paying. As I reached my truck and prepared to drive back to headquarters, I glanced once more at the vast expanse of trees stretching to the horizon. Somewhere within that ancient wilderness, boundaries between worlds had been strengthened, balance restored. Hikers would come and go, admiring the beauty of the landscape without ever knowing the forces that maintained it, the sacrifices made to preserve it. And that, perhaps, was as it should be. Some secrets belonged to the forest alone, shared only with those chosen to bear their weight. I started the engine and began the winding descent down the mountain road, the carved figure a reassuring presence in my pocket, a talisman connecting me to both my ancestral past and the abbreviated future I had willingly accepted as the price of renewal. The forest had claimed me as surely as it had claimed the hikers who had vanished within it, though in a very different way. And in that claiming, I had found my true purpose, My authentic identity as Enolia Dare, descendant of Cherokee forest keepers, guardian of the threshold between worlds. The price had been 20 years of my life. The reward was understanding my place in a cosmic order far older and more complex than modern humanity could comprehend. As balances went, it seemed fair enough. My name is Kanadia Wiakta, and I have walked these mountains for 15 years as a park ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. The name Kennedy was given to me by my grandmother, who still spoke the old Cherokee language with the reverence of someone who remembered when our people lived freely in these hills. Kennedy means the first man and guardian of the hunt in our creation stories, and she said I would need that strength to protect what remained of our sacred lands. The Smokies stretch across the Tennessee-North Carolina border like the spine of some great sleeping beast, encompassing over 500,000 acres of ancient forest. Most visitors see only the popular trails and scenic overlooks, but I know the deep places where the old-growth hardwoods whisper secrets in languages older than English, older even than Cherokee. These are the places where people disappear. It was October when the first strange case landed on my desk, though I didn't recognize it as strange at the time. A college student named Marcus Patterson had gone missing during a solo backpacking trip in the Cataloochee Valley. His abandoned campsite was found 3 days later by other hikers, tent still zipped shut, backpack and supplies untouched. No signs of struggle, no blood, no tracks leading away from the site. It was as if he had simply vanished into the mountain air. I coordinated the search and rescue operation, leading teams of volunteers and fellow rangers through increasingly remote terrain. We found his hiking poles stabbed into the ground about 2 miles from his campsite, standing upright like twin markers on a trail that led to nowhere. Beyond that point, not a single footprint, not a broken branch, nothing to indicate which direction he had gone. On the third day of searching, I was following a game trail along Rough Fork when I found something that made my Cherokee blood run cold. Scratched deep into the bark of an ancient oak tree were symbols I recognized from the stories my grandmother used to tell me as a child. Not Cherokee syllabary, but older markings that belonged to what she called the Old Ones, beings that existed in these mountains before my ancestors arrived, before any human had claimed dominion over these peaks and valleys. The symbols were fresh, the bark still weeping sap. They formed a pattern that my grandmother had once drawn for me in the dirt while explaining why certain parts of the forest were forbidden, why some trails should never be followed after dark. Why you must never call out into the woods unless you were prepared for something other than your own echo to answer. I photographed the markings with my camera, but when I developed the film later, the images showed only normal bark, unblemished and unmarked. Technology, it seemed, could not capture what my eyes had seen, what my ancestry had prepared me to recognize. Marcus Patterson was never found. After a week, the official search was called off. His family came to collect his belongings, and I handed over his backpack while struggling to find words that might comfort them. How could I explain that their son might have encountered something that existed beyond the boundaries of rational explanation? How could I tell them that these mountains held more than bears and fallen logs, and getting lost in conventional ways? 2 weeks later, I was patrolling the Boogerman Trail when I heard singing. Not the casual warbling of day hikers, but something low and haunting that seemed to drift down from the canopy itself. The melody was unfamiliar yet somehow ancient, like a lullaby from a dream I couldn't quite remember. I followed the sound for nearly an hour, climbing off trail through thick undergrowth, until it led me to a clearing I had never seen before despite 15 years of walking these woods. In the center of the clearing stood a massive tulip poplar that must have been growing when my ancestors first set foot in these mountains. Its trunk was easily 12 feet in diameter, and carved into its bark was a spiral of the same symbols I had found at Marcus Patterson's last known location. But these carvings were old, grown over with bark and moss, as if the tree had been claiming them back into itself for decades. I approached the tree slowly, my grandfather's hunting knife heavy on my belt. The Cherokee have always believed that some places are doorways, that the boundary between our world and others grows thin. in certain locations where the earth remembers older truths. Standing before that ancient poplar, I felt the weight of that knowledge pressing against my chest like a physical thing. The singing had stopped, but I wasn't alone in the clearing. I could feel eyes watching me from the shadows between the trees, and my skin prickled with the electricity that comes before a thunderstorm. I pulled out my radio to call in my location, but static was all that emerged from the speaker, broken by what sounded almost like whispered words in a language I didn't recognize. As evening fell, I marked the clearing's location on my GPS and made my way back to the official trail. But even as I walked away, I could feel something following me at a distance, keeping pace but staying just beyond the range of my peripheral vision. When I finally reached my truck, I turned back toward the forest and called out in Cherokee. My voice echoed off the mountainside and faded into silence, but just before I opened the truck door, I heard an answering call from deep in the woods, a sound like wind through stone, like water over ancient bones. That night, I sat on my cabin porch overlooking the Oconaluftee River and tried to make sense of what I had experienced. The rational part of my mind insisted that missing hikers were unfortunately common, that strange sounds in the forest had mundane explanations, that symbols carved in bark were probably the work of teenage vandals. But the Cherokee part of my soul, the part that carried the memories of my ancestors in its DNA, knew better. I pulled out my grandmother's journal, which she had left to me when she passed 5 years ago. Her handwriting was careful and precise as she documented the old stories, the warnings that had been passed down through generations of Cherokee women. I found the entry I was looking for, written in a mixture of English and Cherokee. The Unweetzunsday walk among the old trees when the boundary grows thin. They are neither good nor evil, but they hunger for what we possess, the warmth of human memory, the weight of human dreams. When they take someone, that person becomes lost between worlds, neither fully here nor fully there. The trees remember their footsteps long after their bodies have forgotten how to walk. Below this, she had drawn the same symbols I had seen carved into the bark, along with a note that made my hands tremble as I read it. Kanadi, if you ever see these marks in the forest, know that the old ones are hunting. Stay on the marked trails. Do not follow the singing. Do not answer when they call your name. I closed the journal and stared out at the dark mountains, where thousands of acres of wilderness stretched beyond the reach of electric lights. Somewhere in that darkness, Marcus Patterson might still be wandering, caught between one world and another, neither fully alive nor fully dead. And somewhere in those same shadows, ancient things were stirring, drawn by the scent of human intrusion into their domain. Tomorrow, I would file my report on the unsuccessful search using careful language that would satisfy the bureaucrats without revealing what I really suspected. But tonight, I would stay awake and listen to the sounds drifting down from the mountains, learning to distinguish between the voice of wind in the trees and something far more dangerous calling my name. The Cherokee word for mountain is NVHI, but my grandmother taught me another word, Galvlady, which means the place where spirits gather. As I sat in the darkness with her journal in my lap, I understood that I was not simply a park ranger protecting tourists from bears and steep drops. I was something older, something my ancestors would have recognized, a guardian standing watch at the boundary between worlds, keeping ancient hungers from spilling over into the realm of the living. The night grew deeper around me, and from the forest came the sound of distant singing. 3 weeks passed before the second disappearance. But the mountains did not let me forget that something had changed in their depths. Every patrol brought new signs that only my Cherokee heritage allowed me to recognize. Trees stripped of bark in spiral patterns, stones arranged in circles that definitely hadn't been there the day before, and trails that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The missing woman was named Sarah Chen, a photographer from Atlanta who had come to capture the autumn colors. Unlike Marcus Patterson's abandoned camp, her disappearance was witnessed. According to her hiking partner Jessica, they had been photographing near the Chimney Tops Trail when Sarah wandered off to get a better angle. Jessica heard her camera clicking in the distance, then silence. When she went looking, she found Sarah's expensive camera lying on the ground with its lens shattered, but no other trace of her friend. I interviewed Jessica at the ranger station, noting how her hands trembled as she described the incident. She was a rational woman, a lawyer from Nashville, but something in the mountains had shaken her deeply. There was singing, she told me, her voice barely above a whisper, right before Sarah disappeared. It was beautiful, like a choir, but there was nobody else on the trail. Sarah said she wanted to record it, and that's when she walked away from me. I felt ice form in my stomach. What did the singing sound like? Like voices from underwater, distant but clear. Sarah said it reminded her of something her grandmother used to sing, even though her grandmother was Korean, and this sounded nothing like Korean music. Jessica's eyes met mine. You believe me, don't you? The other rangers keep asking about Sarah's mental state, whether she might have hurt herself falls a mental state. Sarah, but I know what I heard. I believed her because I had heard the same singing. The question was whether I was prepared to do anything about it. That afternoon, I requested permission to conduct an extended patrol in the area where Sarah had vanished. My supervisor, Tom Bradley, was a good man but thoroughly grounded in the practical world of search and rescue statistics and budget constraints. He approved my request without asking too many questions about why I wanted to spend 3 days alone in the backcountry. I packed my gear carefully, including several items that weren't standard ranger equipment. A pouch of tobacco blessed by a Cherokee medicine man in Cherokee, North Carolina. Salt from the ancient sea that once covered these mountains, Inums, and my great-grandfather's bone whistle, which he had carved from the leg bone of a deer he had killed with his bare hands during a vision quest. The trail to Chimney Tops climbed steeply through old-growth forest, past massive hemlocks that had somehow survived the adelgid infestation that had killed so many of their kin. I hiked slowly, stopping frequently to examine the ground for tracks, the trees for markings, the air itself for any hint of the otherworldly presence I knew was lurking somewhere in these hills. I found Sarah's last photograph still on her camera's memory card. The image showed the forest from a low angle, as if she had been kneeling or lying on the ground when she took it. But in the background, barely visible among the shadows between the trees, was a figure that made my Cherokee blood sing with recognition. It was tall and broad-shouldered, covered in dark hair that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its face was turned away from the camera, but its posture suggested something both human and decidedly not human, something that belonged to the old stories my grandmother had whispered to me about creatures that walked upright like men, but followed different laws than those that governed human behavior. Kekle Kudle, she had called them in the old language, the ancient ones who remembered when the world was young, who had made agreements with the Cherokee ancestors that were sealed in blood and maintained through ceremony. But those ceremonies had been disrupted, the agreements forgotten by most, the ancient treaties broken by centuries of displacement and cultural erosion. I camped that night in a grove of white oaks about a mile from where Sarah had disappeared. I built my fire carefully, arranging the stones in the pattern my grandmother had taught me for protection, burning tobacco and cedar while speaking the old words that were supposed to keep harmful spirits at bay. But even as I performed the ritual, I knew that I was operating with incomplete knowledge, that crucial elements of the old ways had been lost when my people were forced from these mountains. The singing began just after midnight. It drifted through the trees like mist, wordless but full of meaning I couldn't quite grasp. The melody was hypnotic, designed to draw listeners deeper into the forest, away from the safety of human fire and human understanding. I forced myself to stay by my fire, even as every instinct urged me to follow the haunting sound to its source. Then I heard Sarah's voice. It came from the same direction as the singing, weak but unmistakable. She was calling for help, pleading for someone to find her. The rational part of my mind knew this was a trap, that whatever had taken her was using her voice to lure me away from my protective circle. But the human part of my heart couldn't ignore a cry for help, regardless of the source. I picked up my rifle and stepped beyond the ring of firelight. The forest was transformed in darkness. Familiar trails twisted in directions that defied the topography I knew by heart. Trees I had climbed as a child seemed to loom larger and more menacing, their branches reaching toward me with what looked like deliberate intent. The singing grew louder as I walked, joined now by what sounded like distant drums and the soft rattling of gourds. I followed Sarah's cries for nearly an hour, guided by my flashlight beam and the Cherokee tracking skills my grandfather had taught me. But I wasn't tracking a human. The footprints I found in the soft earth were massive, easily 18 inches long, with a stride that stretched beyond what any human could manage. Whatever had taken Sarah was carrying her, and it was something I had only heard described in the oldest stories. The trail led to another clearing I had never seen before, despite decades of exploring these mountains. This one was larger than the first, dominated by a ring of standing stones that definitely hadn't been placed there by any geological process. In the center of the ring, a fire burned without any visible fuel, its flames casting shadows that moved independently of their sources. Sarah Chen sat beside the fire, very much alive but somehow changed. Thinking, her skin had taken on a pale, translucent quality, and her eyes reflected light like an animal's. She looked up at me as I entered the clearing, and when she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that made my teeth ache. "Kennedy," she said, though I had never told her my name. "You shouldn't have come here." Behind her, stepping out of shadows that seemed deeper than darkness, came the creature from her photograph. It stood nearly 9 feet tall, its body covered in coarse dark hair that moved with a life of its own. Its face was a disturbing blend of human and something far older, with eyes that held intelligence and hunger in equal measure. When it spoke, the words came in perfect Cherokee, using grammar patterns that hadn't been heard in these mountains for over a century. "Grandson of the Awagta line, we have been waiting for you to come home." The creature's voice resonated through my bones like the call of a sacred drum. A sacred drum. My grandmother's teachings had prepared me for many things, but nothing had truly readied me for standing face to face with a being from the old stories, a Kekle Kudle that spoke my family name with the casual familiarity of an old friend. "My grandmother told me you were myth," I said in Cherokee, my voice steadier than I felt. "Stories to teach children respect for the wilderness." The creature's laugh was like wind through a cave. "Your grandmother knew better. She spoke with my kind many times, maintained the old agreements as long as she was able. But the young ones stopped coming to learn, stopped bringing the proper offerings. The contracts made between your people and mine have been neglected." Sarah Chen sat motionless beside the impossible fire, her transformed eyes reflecting flames that cast no heat. When she turned her head toward me, I could see that she was alive but no longer entirely human. Something fundamental had been changed in her. Some essential quality traded away. "What have you done to her?" I demanded. "What was agreed upon long ago," the creature replied. "When Cherokee walked these mountains, they understood the price of passage through our territory. 1 soul for 7 years of safe hunting. 1 dreamer to feed our hunger for 7 seasons of protection from the darker things that dwell in the deep places." I felt understanding dawn like ice water in my veins. The disappearances weren't random predation. They were collection of an ancient debt, payment for contract my ancestors had made when they first entered these mountains centuries ago. My people had promised to provide tribute in exchange for safe passage and protection, but when we were forced out during the Trail of Tears, the arrangements had been forgotten by all but a few. "The old agreements died when our people were driven away," I said. "Agreements made in blood do not die with exile," the creature replied. "They sleep, waiting for the bloodlines to return. Your grandmother honored the old ways as long as she could, but she had no descendants who would listen, no young ones willing to carry the burden. When she died, the debt began to compound. It gestured toward Sarah with one massive clawed hand. This one and the other, they are interest on what is owed. But you, grandson of a Wiakta, you can restore the proper balance." He can restore the proper balance. I understood now why my grandmother had named me Kanadi, why she had filled my childhood with stories of guardianship and responsibility. She had known this day would come, had prepared me as best she could for a choice between personal safety and ancient obligation. "What do you want from me?" "Serve as your ancestors did, become the bridge between your people and mine, ensure that we receive what was promised, the dreams of those who walk our trails, the memories of those who camp in our territory. Not all of them, not their lives, but enough to sustain us until the world changes again." Gandhi. The creature stepped closer and I could smell the deep forest scent of it, moss and loam, and something wilder than any animal I had ever encountered. "In return, your kind will walk safely in our domain. The true predators that hunt in darkness will not touch them. The trails will not shift beneath their feet. The hungry spirits that dwell in the deep places will know they are under our protection. And if I refuse, its eyes, dark as mountain pools, held depths I couldn't fathom. Then the old contract remains broken, and we will collect what we can when we can. More will disappear. More will be changed. The debt will grow until it consumes all who carry Cherokee blood in these mountains. I looked at Sarah, trying to gauge how much of her original self remained behind those reflecting eyes. She seemed to understand my thoughts because she spoke for the first time since I had entered the clearing. "It doesn't hurt," she said, her voice carrying strange harmonics. I remember being human, but it feels like remembering a dream. This is more complete. I can hear the mountains breathing, feel the trees thinking. I know things I never knew I needed to know. "She speaks truth," the creature said. "We do not destroy. We transform, enhance, make more than what was. The young man you seek still wanders our realm, learning to see with new eyes, to hear with new ears. He is becoming something greater than he was." I thought of Marcus Patterson, somewhere in a space between worlds, possibly transformed into something like Sarah. The rational part of my mind recoiled from the impossibility of it all, but my Cherokee heritage sang with recognition. These were the deep truths my grandmother had tried to prepare me for, the responsibilities that came with being a bridge between the human world and the older powers that still moved through the mountains. "I need time to think," I said. "Time moves differently here," the creature replied. "You may have as much as you require." I sat down beside the strange fire, pulling out my grandmother's journal and my great-grandfather's bone whistle. As I held these objects, connection to my ancestors flowed through me like electric current. I could feel their presence in the shadows at the edge of the clearing, generations of Cherokee who had walked these mountains and made choices that echoed across centuries. The whistle felt warm in my hands, and when I brought it to my lips, the sound that emerged was not the simple note I expected at the end. Instead, it carried the voices of my people, the songs they had sung in these hills before roads and rangers and the modern world had changed everything. The creature listened with evident pleasure, and even Sarah's transformed features showed something like happiness. "Your great-grandfather made this whistle from the bone of a deer that offered itself to him during his vision quest," the creature said. "He carved it while fasting in a cave not far from here, seeking guidance about whether to stay in these mountains or follow his people west. In these mountains, the deer spirit told him that some must stay to maintain the old agreements, that some must remain as guardians, even if it meant living apart from their tribe." I had never heard this story, but holding the whistle, I felt its truth in my bones. My great-grandfather had stayed behind, becoming something between Cherokee and white, belonging fully to neither world, but serving as a bridge between them. My grandmother had carried that burden after him, and now it was being offered to me. If I agree to serve as guardian, what happens to them? I asked, nodding toward Sarah. "They may choose. Some prefer to remain as they are, walking between worlds, experiencing existence in ways humans cannot imagine. Others wish to return to their former lives, though they keep memories of what they have seen. The choice is always theirs. The choice is always theirs." Sarah looked at me with those reflecting eyes. "I think I want to stay," she said, "just for a while. There's so much to learn here, so much to understand. And someone needs to help the others who arrive to ease their transition." I thought of Marcus Patterson, alone and confused in a realm beyond human understanding, and realized that Sarah was offering to serve as a guide for future travelers, a familiar human face to make the impossible transformation less terrifying. The weight of decision pressed down on me like the mountain itself. I could walk away, report both Sarah and Marcus as missing persons, never speak of what I had seen. I could transfer to a different park, try to forget the singing in the woods and the ancient symbols carved in bark. I could live a normal life serving as a conventional park ranger, protecting tourists from conventional dangers. Or I could accept the role my bloodline had prepared me for, becoming a guardian at the boundary between worlds, ensuring that ancient contracts were honored and that both sides received what they needed to survive. I stood up, holding my great-grandfather's whistle, and faced the creature that had been waiting for my decision since my grandmother died. "I accept," I said in Cherokee, I will serve as guardian." The creature's massive head tilted in what might have been approval. "Then let us begin." The ritual of becoming a guardian took place at dawn, when the boundary between night and day mirrors the threshold between worlds. The creature who told me his name was Invidsingste, which meant stone giant in the old Cherokee, led me to a cave hidden beneath an outcropping of granite that I had passed hundreds of times without noticing. Inside the cave, the walls were covered with paintings that told the story of the first compact between my ancestors and the ancient inhabitants of these mountains. The artwork was older than anything I had seen in museums, executed in pigments that seemed to glow with their own light. It showed Cherokee hunters offering tobacco and cornmeal to towering figures that might have been bears standing upright, or men transformed by generations of living in the deep wilderness. "Your ancestors understood what most humans have forgotten," Envi Tsunsdi explained as he mixed pigments in a bowl carved from what looked like a single massive gemstone. "They knew that every place of power requires a guardian, someone who can speak both languages, understand both needs." The paint he applied to my face and hands was warm and seemed to move against my skin like something alive. As he worked, he spoke the old words that formalized the compact, binding me to serve as an intermediary between the human world and the realm of the ancient ones. And I felt the weight of the obligation settling into my bones like lead, but also a strange sense of completion, as if I was finally becoming what I had always been meant to be. When the ritual was finished, I could see the forest with new eyes. The boundaries between worlds had become visible as shimmering curtains of light that moved between the trees. I could hear the voices of the mountains themselves, deep conversations carried on in frequencies below human hearing. Most importantly, I could feel the presence of every human who entered the territory under my protection. Their dreams and fears and memories creating bright spots in my awareness like candle flames in a dark room. Sarah Chen emerged from the shadows where she had been waiting, no longer quite human, but not entirely transformed either. She had chosen a middle path, retaining enough of her original nature to serve as an ambassador, while gaining enough of the Ancient One's abilities to move safely through their realm. "Marcus wanted to see you before you left," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that spoke of vast spaces and deep time. Marcus Patterson stepped out from behind a standing stone that hadn't been there moments before. Like Sarah, he had been changed but not consumed. His eyes held depths that spoke of visions beyond human comprehension, but when he smiled, it was still recognizably him. "Thank you," he said simply, "for accepting this burden so that others like us have a choice." I understood then that my role would involve more than just maintaining ancient contracts. I would serve as a guide for those who were taken, helping them understand their options and making sure they were never transformed against their will. Some would choose to return to their human lives with memories that would seem like vivid dreams. Others would elect to remain, becoming part of the ecology of wonder that existed in the spaces between worlds. Invite Sunsdi led me back to the edge of normal reality, where my truck waited exactly where I had left it, though I felt as though I had been away for weeks rather than a single night. The morning sun was breaking over the ridgeline, painting the mountains in shades of gold and amber that reminded me of the pigments used in the cave paintings. "How will I know when someone needs help?" I asked. "You will know," he assured me. "The awareness comes with the binding. You will feel their fear when they first hear our singing, sense their confusion when they realize they are no longer entirely in the world they understand. Some will need guidance to find their way back. Others will need help accepting their transformation. A few will require protection from the darker things that hunt in the spaces between." He handed me a small bag woven from what looked like spider silk but felt stronger than leather. Inside were items I would need for my new duties. Tobacco blessed by the Ancient Ones, salt from underground seas, crystals that could anchor spirits to specific locations, and other tools whose purposes I would learn through experience. "Remember," Envisionsdi said as he prepared to fade back into the forest, "you are not alone in this work. Your grandmother's spirit watches from the Nightland. Your great-grandfather's wisdom flows in your blood, and we are always listening for your call." I drove back to the ranger station as the morning shift was beginning, my appearance normal enough that nobody questioned where I had been or what I had been doing. I filed my report on Sarah Chen's disappearance, documenting the shattered camera and the witness statement about mysterious singing, carefully avoiding any mention of what I had actually discovered. Over the following weeks, I learned to live with my dual nature. During daylight hours, I performed my regular duties as a park ranger, leading search and rescue operations, educating visitors about wildlife safety, maintaining trails and facilities. But as the sun set and the boundaries between worlds grew thin, I became something else entirely. The first test of my new abilities came 3 weeks later, when a family camping in Elkmont reported that their teenage daughter had wandered away after claiming she heard music in the forest. I found her within an hour, standing in a grove of ancient chestnuts that had somehow survived the blight that had destroyed most of their species. She was listening to singing that only she could hear, already beginning the first stages of transformation. "It's beautiful," she told me when I approached carefully, speaking the words and Weitsundsdi had taught me for addressing those caught between worlds. "The music is so beautiful. They want me to come with them." "They're offering you a choice," I explained, settling down beside her on the forest floor. "You can go with them and see wonders beyond human imagination, but you'll be changed by the experience. Or you can come back with me to your family, and the music will fade until it's just a memory." She was quiet for a long time, tears streaming down her face as she wrestled with a decision no 16-year-old should have to make. The music stopped as we walked back toward the campground, but I could feel eyes watching us from the shadows between the trees. The ancient ones were honoring the compact, respecting her choice because I had ensured she truly understood what she was choosing between. Her parents never knew how close they had come to losing their daughter to something beyond their understanding. She had simply gotten lost and been found by a ranger who knew the woods better than most. But as I handed her over to their tearful embraces, I saw her look back toward the forest with eyes that held a deep longing for the music she would never quite forget. This became my pattern: ranger by day, guardian by night, protecting both sides of an ancient compact that kept the balance between worlds intact. Some of those I encountered chose transformation, disappearing into the realm of the ancient ones to become something more than human. Others chose to return to their normal lives, carrying memories of impossible beauty that would inspire them for the rest of their days. The missing person reports continued, but now they were part of a larger pattern that only I could see. Each disappearance was a choice made freely, each return a victory for the principle that beings from either world deserved to control their own destinies. Standing on my cabin porch as winter settled over the Smokies, I thought about my grandmother's journal and the wisdom she had tried to pass on. She had known this day would come, had prepared me as best she could for a responsibility that stretched back generations. The mountains were full of secrets, but they were no longer my burden to carry alone. In the distance, barely audible over the wind, I could hear singing drifting down from the high peaks, but now I understood the voices in that harmony. Ancient ones and transformed humans, Cherokee ancestors and mountain spirits, all part of a chorus that had been singing since the world was young. "My name is Kenadia Wiakta, and I am the guardian of lost souls, the keeper of ancient contracts, the bridge between worlds that should not touch but cannot be completely separated. When people disappear in these mountains, I am the one who finds them, who offers them choices, who ensures that the old agreements are honored with wisdom and compassion. The Smokies stretch around me like the dreams of sleeping giants, and in their depths, wonders and terrors dance together in patterns older than human memory. I am their guardian, and they are mine, bound together by blood and oath and the weight of stories that must be preserved for generations yet to come. The mountains are calling, and I am listening.